cities of the United States is quaint New Orleans, where the Cathedral of St. Louis majestically rises above the Place d'Armes in the center of the city, reminding us of the days when the flag of France waved over New Orleans, the Queen City of Louisiana. Two other famous landmarks in the Place d'Armes are the statue of General Jackson, hero of the War of 1812, and this old Spanish shrine known as the Cabildo, where Louisiana was transferred from Spain to France and later from France to the United States. It is now a museum housing historic mementos of old New Orleans. Pirates Alley takes us back to the days when Spanish and French Romeos wooed their ladies fair and romantic old world music resounded from behind shuttered windows. Modern traffic has in no way interfered with business at the old French market, a world-famous institution which has thrived under the dominion of the old and the new world and is still doing business at the original stand, established about 130 years ago. If an observer were called upon to mention a truly characteristic feature of this quaint city, he could not help but refer to these iron trellised balconies, many of which were imported from France and Spain, reminding us again of old world influence. No city in the New World or the Old can excel New Orleans for its famous restaurants, one of the best known of which is Antoine's, founded almost 100 years ago, and still maintaining the reputation of its excellent cuisine. Standing on the site of the residence of a former governor of the French colony is the Court of the Two Sisters, where the color and romance of old New Orleans mingles with the spirit of modern times. Another famous landmark in the long list of New Orleans' many fine eating places is that of Broussard's, which specializes in concoctions of appetizing foods served in a novel and entertaining manner. Eating and drinking rank as fine arts in old New Orleans, and the flavor of the past is kept vitally alive in its restaurants. A dessert resembling crêpe Suzette is one of the popular dishes for which this restaurant is famous. And here is another palatable dish known as Broussard's Surprise. Showmanship seems to be an essential part of serving food in this unique restaurant, where even Mephistopheles is featured in the very auspicious routine of serving Café Brûlot, a black coffee cooked with cognac and flavored with orange peel and spices. The presiding guest in this old French setting is none other than Napoleon Bonaparte himself, and every time French brandy is served, the event is celebrated as we see it here. And this serving of good food and drink, which is the policy of all the New Orleans restaurants, is just an old French custom. City Park is another famous landmark which dramatically associates itself with the colorful days of French and Spanish rule. It was here that fencing was a popular sport and affairs of honor were settled by pistol or sword in the shade of these old trees, better known as the dueling oaks. Perhaps the most famous duelist of that time was Jose Ulloa, who is said to have maintained a cemetery for the benefit of the many victims who fell at the point of his sword. St. Louis Cemetery is one of the oldest in New Orleans, having been established over 2 centuries ago. In this historic city of the dead are the mortal remains of those who helped to found New Orleans. They are interred above ground because in former days the city was too near the level of the sea and modern drainage was then unthought of. Many of these tombs consist of 2 vaults with a crypt below in which the bones are kept. After a period of time prescribed by law, the tombs may be opened, the coffins broken and burned, and the remains deposited in the crypts. By this method, a single tomb may serve the same family for generations. Almost 2 centuries ago, these picturesque old trees were planted by the early French settlers, and today they are referred to as the Versailles Oaks. This unique pilot house, situated near the shores of the Mississippi, was built by an old retired pilot who could not end his days too far from his beloved river and the paddle-wheel steamers that still ply their way, slowly but steadily, up and down the Mississippi. Here in the spell of the romantic past that we most reluctantly say farewell to old New Orleans. Pacific Ocean lies Australia, important though remote outpost of European civilization, which we visited just prior to its involvement in the latest World War. Regardless of what the future may hold in store for this strategic land, former impressions cannot be obliterated, and it is with this thought that we now present a pictorial review of our memories of Australia. We recall the city of Melbourne with a population of over 1 million inhabitants, all of whom opened their arms in welcome to the great war hero, General MacArthur, and pledged themselves with all of Australia to support him and the cause of democracy. In the cities of Australia, we were particularly reminded of modern progress, which is a great credit to that branch of the white race that has so commendably established itself down under the equator, over 9,000 miles from its mother country. But geographical isolation had in no way curtailed the modern spirit of Melbourne. In fact, it seemed to have helped it. as we found a general tendency on the part of the people to be ultra-modern in their viewpoints, and all departments of civic service competed in the performance of their respective duties. Of all the beautiful gardens in Melbourne, there was one in particular that bore unusual distinction, for it was officially dedicated to the pioneer women of Victoria, and it inspired Nathaniel Shilkret to compose a song which he dedicated to this garden, as well as to the modern women of Australia.
A miss that's modern and this old-fashioned garden combined are too divine to be true. They are the theme of the loveliness you dream of, the future that you scheme of for you. She's just a little old-fashioned and yet enough modern, a beautiful bloom in a lovely garden. I'd like the power to paint this modern flower in this old-fashioned garden of love.
With much reluctance, we left Melbourne and continued our journey on Australia's crack train, the Spirit of Progress, en route to New South Wales. Among the scenic highlights of Australia, we recall the Blue Hills region, noted for the blue haze which hangs in the valleys at all seasons of the year. Here is illustrated something of the vast uninhabited areas of a country the size of which is seldom appreciated by the world at large. To those of us who think of Australia as a little South Sea island down under the equator, inhabited largely by primitive bushmen, let it be known that it is about the size of the United States in land area, although its population hardly exceeds that of New York City, and almost 98% of this population is of British origin. The Australians are an outdoor-loving people, justifiably proud of the many natural attractions with which Mother Nature has so generously endowed their country. This love of outdoor life also manifests itself in the cities, such as Sydney, where the streets are wide, clean, and airy. Sydney has grown so rapidly that it now has over 1.25 million inhabitants. The Commonwealth of Australia is composed of 6 states, the most populous of which is New South Wales, with Sydney as its capital. And each of these states is governed by a parliament over which a premier presides. In the suburbs of Sydney, we found picturesque and colorful parks, abounding in subtropical vegetation, and a general atmosphere of peace and tranquility. The Taronga Zoological Park and Aquarium, one of Sydney's chief attractions, was noted for its rare specimens of plants and animals and birds, not the least of which were the kookaburras, also known as the laughing jackasses of Australia. One of nature's greatest freaks is the duck-billed platypus, which is at ease in water as well as on land. It has a fur coat, a beaver-like tail, and webbed feet. It quacks like a duck, cries like a baby, and, believe it or not, it lays eggs and suckles its young. The most lovable animals in this land of animal oddities are the little koalas, the teddy bears of Australia. Koalas are nocturnal in their habits, and consequently, most of their daylight hours are spent in sleep. At night, they prowl about from tree to tree, seeking a certain type of eucalyptus leaf, which is their only food. At about 4 years of age, koala is fully grown and may live for 15 or 20 years. In Australia, but nowhere else. Aside from animals, Taronga Park also featured many unusual floral attractions, as well as colorful vistas of the world-famous Sydney Harbor. Only a few years ago, this harbor was a haven of peace, although even then the distant drums of war were warning Australians of the Japanese menace, and nervous minds were already forecasting sinister and inevitable things to come. Sydney Harbor has many gateways which open to friends as they close to enemies, and it will probably figure as one of the great turning points in the Pacific theater of the war. The sight of this gigantic Empress of Britain floating so peacefully here fills our hearts with sadness, for she has since found a watery grave on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, a victim of the ravages of war. At the time of our visit, boating, fishing, surfboard riding, and swimming were the popular sports, and they were engaged in with a spirit of gaiety that was fittingly expressed in another song composed by Nathaniel Shilkret and dedicated to Bondi Beach.
Starry nights on the beautiful beach of Bondi, what a chance for romance within everyone's reach here at Bondi. Every breeze from the seas whispers, please hurry back for we miss you. Troubles will fly, bid them goodbye here on the beautiful beach of Bondi.
At club carnivals, members competed in life-saving events, which were dramatized for the entertainment of the vast audiences that witnessed them. Most of the men marching in this impressive parade have since been marching on the battlefields of Africa and Europe, as well as in the jungles of Malaya. And we can judge by what we see here something of the strength and fortitude that characterizes the fighting men of Australia. Although these picturesque scenes only serve to remind us of a time when Australia was at peace, they help to illustrate the human fiber that is Australia. And we feel that when the final history of the latest World War is written, the Australians will have proved themselves worthy of their responsibility as the guardians of democracy in the Southwest Pacific, way down under the equator. And it is with this thought that we now conclude our memories of Australia. Peacefully reclining in the picturesque highlands of Guatemala lies the little town of Chichicastenango, one of the most colorful and interesting villages in all of Central America, it being the center of a region inhabited by almost 50,000 Indians, descendants of a once highly civilized people known as Mayas, who inhabited this land about 2,000 years ago. The colorful and imposing archway which forms the main entrance to Chichicastenango, however, owes its construction to the genius of the white man, for the ancient Mayas, with all their proverbial architectural skill, never discovered the principle of the arch. Fortunately for us, we have arrived on a market day, a day of great importance to the native Indians who tote their loads from distant hills and valleys to the marketplace, very much as their ancestors did hundreds of years ago. Aside from the business of trading, the marketplace is the center of the Mayan social life, in which the news of the day is exchanged, and all the gossip of the region is whispered from ear to ear. Indians of Chichicastenango completely disdain the idea of using horses or wheels by way of assisting them in transporting their burdens. And there are still some of them in the outlying districts who may never have seen a horse and do not yet know the principle of the wheel. It has been said that some of these Indians have become so accustomed to carrying heavy loads upon their backs that they actually weight themselves down with stones when traveling if they have nothing else to carry, the thought being to keep in fit condition at all times for the unfailing burdens of life. Every day is a day of worship here, but on market days in particular, the Church of Santo Tomas is the center of constant activity, where even the village barber sets up shop and carries on his business. Although modern style of dress is slowly being introduced by a small group, the vast majority of the Indians still cling to the traditional costumes of their ancestors, as well as the manners and customs. Some historians claim that the unique garb of these Indians was worn by the Chichis long before the Spanish conquest, thereby disproving the popular theory that the Indians copied their costumes from the Spanish conquistadores. And now, by way of interesting contrast, let us divert our thoughts from the Indians and step into the patio of the Mayan Inn, where we may dance to the music of the marimba in a setting that seems to be part of another world. While we indulge in this delightful diversion of the white man, the Indians at the Church of Santo Tomas participate in their favorite diversion, which is of a much more serious nature. Perhaps there is no place on this earth where one may witness a stranger demonstration of religious fervor than here, where fanatically devout Indians, with mingled ideas and confused interpretations, combine the worship of their ancestors' pagan gods with the simple Catholic faith taught them by the Spanish priests over 400 years ago. Inside the church, there are no pews, for the Indians prefer to do their praying on the floor, kneeling before lighted candles surrounded by petals of flowers, proving their appreciation for color and beauty, even though their interpretation of the Christian religion may be somewhat distorted and confused. The pastor of this unique church is Father Ildefonso Rosbach, who came to Guatemala many years ago as a bookkeeper for a commercial firm. The plight of the Indians, however, aroused his sympathy, as well as his inherent desire to become a missionary. He went back to the United States to study for the priesthood, and in due time returned to Chichicastenango as a Catholic priest. That was in 1907. And since that time, he has been devoting his vocation exclusively to the Indians, who literally worship him. They regard him as a saint who can miraculously bless the souls of the departed, baptize the newborn, and give ear to the sorrows and sins of the living. Tinged with the Indians' faint understanding of the Padres' religion is the old Mayan mysticism practiced on the lowest step of the church, where the native incense is burned so that the smoke therefrom will carry messages to the floating spirits of their ancestors, to whom they beg to come and intervene with them in their prayers to the divinities. old-fashioned garden within the shadow of the church, Padre Rosbach communes with himself. Although he enjoys solitude, he is always glad to welcome visitors from the outside world. With pride, he talks about his beloved flock of 33,000 Indians, scattered over an area of 500 miles. He admits that not all the ceremonies practiced by his followers are in strict accordance with the ritual of the Catholic Church. But he explains the average Indian mind is not constituted to comprehend abstract doctrines of theology. Therefore, he must make certain allowances and only administer such sacraments as Holy Communion to the better educated Indians who understand the function. And now, while Father Rosbach prepares himself for another journey into the far reaches of his enormous parish, we observe again the pagan-like worship in front of the church. The remarkable fact about this whole demonstration is that after the Mayans complete their worship at the Christian shrines, many of them retire to the hills and uncover the hidden images of their ancient Mayan gods and pray to them in sincerest reverence, even as their ancestors did long before the coming of the white man. The moral of it all seeming to be that they are willing to accept the Christian religion, provided it does not prevent them from worshiping the pagan gods of their forefathers. And now it is time for Padre Rosbach to set forth on one of his regular missions to administer to the souls and bodies of the sick and needy who cannot come to him in Chichicastenango. In spite of his 70 years, he has been known to rise in the cold of darkest night and travel even on foot if need be, over mountains and through streams, in order to bear to some dying Indian the last rites of the church. And so it is that this solitary white man, now nearing the end of his long and lonesome life, continues to practice and teach Catholicism to a flock of semi-pagans, many of whom have become his devout followers, even though they may still be confused about the true meaning of the faith which has so admirably sustained Padre Rosbach, the living saint of Chichicastenango. This is the historic old harbor of Veracruz, Mexico's chief port of entry and the original starting point of the Spanish conquest. For it was in this locale over 4 centuries ago that Cortez, with his valiant band of Spanish conquistadores, met the representatives of Moctezuma and later followed them 300 miles inland to the Aztec capital, which is now known as the City of Mexico. Commanding a conspicuous place at the entrance to the harbor is an old Spanish fort known as the Castillo de San Juan, the last Spanish stronghold on Mexican soil at the close of the War for Independence. The fact that this picturesque old landmark has withstood the incessant pounding of the sea for more than 400 years is indisputable evidence of how solidly it was constructed. Until the beginning of the 20th century, it was used as a penal settlement, and its gruesome dungeons of confinement are silent witnesses to the human suffering that must have taken place here in the tragic days of yore. In recent years, the port of Veracruz has been thoroughly renovated, and many of its architectural ruins have been supplanted by fine modern buildings, including one of the best apartment hotels in Mexico. Nevertheless, a panorama of the city itself reveals that most of the old Spanish architecture still remains, perpetuating the city's reputation for being the oldest Spanish settlement in the Republic. In its tempestuous era of time, this peaceful-looking metropolis has battled with hurricanes from the sea and plagues from the land. It has been repeatedly sacked by pirates and buccaneers, and it has been bombarded by foreign fleets. But through it all, Veracruz has valiantly survived. As in all typically Spanish towns, the center of social life is to be found in the main plaza, where on Sundays and holidays one may see a very colorful gathering. But the time of our visit happens to be just an ordinary working day, during the hour of siesta, when human life is almost at a standstill, and only gringos venture forth in the noonday sun. Overlooking the plaza is the municipal palace, construction of which was begun just 17 years after Columbus discovered America. It is said to be the first and oldest city hall in this hemisphere. Another picturesque landmark in the plaza is the Church of Our Lady of the Assumption, occupying the site of a similar edifice erected by the Spaniards soon after they sailed into the harbor and founded the town of the True Cross. A glimpse of the old residential district now engages our attention and reveals to us one of the reasons why Veracruz is credited with being more Spanish than any other city in Mexico. Regardless of what they may have done to the contrary, it must be admitted that the old Spanish conquistadores brought to the New World imperishable contributions from their mother country, such as architecture, music, and the spirit of romance. And speaking of romance, this colorful balcony of Spanish tile affords an ideal setting. Although Veracruz has clung tenaciously to its romantic and thrilling past, it has not neglected its present or future. And ample proof of this is seen in the new residential section, where spaciously paved thoroughfares lead to elaborately constructed homes, traditionally Spanish, yet modern in architectural design. The sight of an attractive home, regardless of where it is, arouses in us a natural longing for home sweet home. But thanks to that substituting institution, known as a hotel, we find momentary respite and consolation among a people who know how to entertain visitors. Dancing is an inherent tradition here, where even the children learn to dance as soon as they are able to stand on their feet. And now let us observe this happy and carefree bevy of Veracruz maidens, who find pleasure in the more simple diversions of life and take great pride in the preservation of the legends and traditions which they inherited from their ancestors. A typically Mexican dancing stunt, which has not lost its popularity in Veracruz, is known as the bow dance, in which the dancers attempt to tie a bow with their feet while dancing. Although it may look simple, it is really a very difficult feat for feet to perform, and that's not meant as a pun. Just watch it, and if you're inclined that way, choose a partner and try it yourself sometime. That proves there's more than one way of getting a bowl. And now we go for a swim on the famous Mocamba Beach, where we find excellent bathing in water that's just the right temperature for us. Perhaps the most popular diversion as well as occupation in Veracruz is fishing. As a commercial enterprise, it is one of the leading industries of Mexico. In fact, a large amount of the fish that is consumed in the Republic comes from Veracruz. Net fishing is usually performed along the beaches, which are drawn with huge nets that often encompass a half-acre of sea in one draw. This style of fishing is usually performed at late twilight or early dawn. The nets are all hand-woven by the fishermen themselves, and some idea of the size of these nets is illustrated here, where we see hundreds of yards of netting spread out to dry. Aside from commercial fishing, Veracruz is a veritable paradise for amateur fishermen who come here from all parts of the country to indulge in their favorite pastime. And now we are about to witness a most humiliating scene, for this overconfident fisherman has promised his lady companion that he is about to catch the largest fish that ever came out of an ocean on a fisherman's line. And here it is. Is he embarrassed? It's about the smallest specimen to be found in the Gulf of Mexico. But here is something more like it. And they get bigger and bigger. And so the fishing goes in the historic waters around Veracruz, waters that abound in fish as well as relics of history. For down deep on the ocean floor, over which fishermen silently cast their lines, there may be found a scattered assortment of iron and stone cannonballs, bayonets, and numerous other relics of a stormy past that gringos like to hear about when they visit Veracruz. California, just north of the Mexican border, stands the mission of San Diego, built in 1769, the first in the famous chain of 21 missions extending northward for over 500 miles from San Diego to Sonoma. The purpose of these missions was to bring Christian faith and civilization to the savage Indians and provide living accommodations for the weary traveler along the mission trail. The man whose leadership was responsible for the construction of most of these picturesque institutions was Father Junipero Serra, a Franciscan monk. Each mission was placed a day's journey or about 30 miles apart, traveling on foot as the Padres usually traveled. But as we now travel in a comfortable automobile, it averages less than an hour from mission to mission. San Luis Rey, king of the missions, was founded in 1798 and is now under the care of the Franciscan Fathers. Over 60,000 cattle roamed its vast land holdings. 3,000 Indians labored in the surrounding fields, and its temporal goods were valued at more than $200,000. The Mission Museum still possesses many valuable relics and priceless mementos of early days in California, as well as the largest collection of old mission vestments in North America. This colorful vestment is about 300 years old, and it is believed to have been worn by Father Perry, who was in charge of San Luis Rey on the day of its founding and for a period of 34 years thereafter. This massive book of illuminated parchment is one of the priceless treasures of San Luis Rey. Here today, aspirants to the Franciscan priesthood still pursue their religious and philosophical studies, as well as the laborious physical chores, which are part of their duties. The modern road which now connects the missions is known as El Camino Real, or the King's Highway, and it follows the old mission trail that was blazed by the sandaled feet of Junipero Serra. San Juan Capistrano is famous for the annual Flight of the Swallows, which incidentally is not confined alone to Capistrano, as practically all of the missions have to contend with the peregrinations of the swallows. This is the grand old mission of San Gabriel, founded in 1771. When the Padres were seeking the site for this mission, they were suddenly surrounded by a band of savages. Fearing an attack, one of the friars unfurled a banner of the Virgin Mary and held it up to the gaze of the Indians, who were so overcome that they threw down their bows and arrows and immediately offered their pipe of peace to the Padres in exchange for the miraculous banner of the Virgin. San Fernando Mission, a few miles north of Los Angeles, is a good example of Spanish architecture. In the early days, more than 1,100 Indians lived at this mission and were patiently guided and taught the labors and crafts of the white men. Mission San Buenaventura was founded on Easter Sunday in 1782 and was, within 10 years of its founding, one of the most flourishing settlements in California. The benevolent old mission at Santa Barbara is a joy to the traveler today, as it must have been when the sandal-footed Padres plodded their weary way along the coast and climbed the hillsides, ever onward that they might reach this haven ere night befell. In order to reach the Indians beyond the coast, the Mission Santa Ynez was founded in a valley, which is one of the most fertile and beautiful spots in California. Since 1804, this old adobe patriarch has graciously watched the coming and going of generations. Regular services are held in the mission church for the spiritual comfort of the people who live in the surrounding communities, and the bells of Santa Ynez still ring out their benediction as a tribute to the early Padres who visioned, suffered, and worked to establish happiness, comfort, and beauty in California. In the peaceful monastery garden of Santa Ynez, we meet 3 members of the Capuchin order who endeavor to follow in the footsteps of St. Francis by living a life of strict poverty while serving the cause of humanity to the fullest extent of their ability. Over the hills from Santa Ynez, the Franciscan fathers founded La Purísima Concepcion, which differs from all the other missions in that the entire establishment has been reconstructed. For a number of years, La Purísima was the seat of government for the California missions. We next visit San Luis Obispo. Established in 1772, this mission prospered and became famous because of the fact that here tiles were first manufactured. The Franciscans at San Luis became proficient in this industry, and not long thereafter, all the missions used red tile roofs, a good example of which is San Miguel, standing much as it did over 150 years ago. On July 14th, 1771, Father Junipero Serra established this mission and named it San Antonio in honor of St. Anthony. While addressing the Padres who were with him, Father Serra noticed the presence of a pagan Indian who was attracted by the sound of the mission bell. He approached the Indian and gave him some small gifts. From that day on, the natives appeared in crowds to see Father Serra, whose language they did not understand, but whose gentleness had won their hearts. Although most of the original missions have been restored, there are a few that seem to be beyond restoration. And one of these is the mission Nuestra Señora de la Soledad, founded in 1791 as a midway stop between Santa Ynez and Carmel. From the beginning of its history, it has truly been a mission of seclusion and solitude. In interesting contrast to this heap of ruins is San Juan Bautista, one of the real gems of Father Serra's Rosary of Missions, established in 1797. Perhaps more than any other mission, San Juan illustrates the architectural and engineering skill of the early padres, who taught savage Indians the arts and crafts of old Spain and used them in the construction of these picturesque establishments. Although the mission trail extends itself to Sonoma, just north of San Francisco, our time is limited to one more important landmark, beautifully situated in the Valley of Carmel, originally named San Carlos, but more familiarly known as Carmel Mission, founded by Father Serra and used as his headquarters during the time he established the first 9 of the famous 21 missions. He died here in 1784, and his mortal remains were buried beneath this imposing structure, which is in itself a fitting tribute to his memory. In summarizing the life of Junipero Serra, we would say that he was the man who first blazed the trail of Christianity in California, and in doing so, he brought with him the more temporal seeds that were planted in the soil to come forth as the Golden State's first oranges, lemons, figs, olives, and wheat, as well as a variegated abundance of plants and flowers. In his missionary journeys, Father Serra walked over 6,500 miles despite an ulcerated leg. His life and virtues are now being contemplated by the Pope, and it is possible that his justly deserved beatification may soon be announced. And if so, we hope to be the first to revere him as the beloved saint of the Mission Trail. Yes, this is post-war London, the mother city of the British Empire, where the mantle of peace has again fallen over a war-wearied people. London, the city of tradition, wherein once dwelt William the Conqueror, Henry VIII, Cromwell, Milton, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and thousands of others whose names have all become traditional throughout the world. London, the hub of British culture, where the historic Thames still flows uninterrupted on its ancient course, under famous bridges, some old, some new, and some blitzed. Yes, there has been a war here, the worst war in the turbulent history of the British Empire, and we will soon see material evidence of it. But the spirit of Britain survives, and the old Union Jack still waves triumphantly over the land. And still stands the old Royal Exchange, originally patterned after the Bourse in Antwerp, and the Bank of England, the financial center of the British Empire, and the famous Marble Arch, which serves as one of the gateways to Hyde Park, where the people of London gather again to praise or condemn the events of the day, or merely enjoy the diversions of a public park. Outstanding among the familiar landmarks is Buckingham Palace, London residence of the royal family. It was originally built by the Duke of Buckingham as a townhouse for himself and later purchased by King George III. The monument in front is a fitting tribute to Queen Victoria, who made the palace her residence during her long and glorious reign. Admiralty Archway at the west side of Trafalgar Square is also part of the National Memorial to Queen Victoria. Here at Malaya House, we see a little evidence of the blitz that spared Trafalgar Square and its famous landmarks, such as the National Gallery, housing one of the world's finest collections of great paintings, and St. Martin's in the Fields Church, always open to the underprivileged, and the Nelson Monument, erected to the memory of England's great naval hero, Horatio Lord Nelson, who won the Battle of Trafalgar and gave his life for his country. Thus far, we have seen very little material evidence of what the recent war has done to London. In fact, comparatively few of its historic landmarks have been destroyed. But we will direct our attention now to some of the damage that was done by bombing. This is the Port of London Authority building. Its massive tower stands upright in the midst of a shattered top story, where all of the offices were destroyed except one. And that one, at the time of our visit, was still doing uninterrupted business at the old stand. An ancient landmark that was severely blitzed is that section of London known as the Temple, or the Law Courts, once the headquarters of the Knights Templar. But since the 14th century, it has been inhabited principally by a community of lawyers or barristers. Among the many historic events that have been associated with this hallowed ground was the presentation of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, in which Shakespeare himself took a leading part with his own players. And this is all that remains of the birthplace of Charles and Mary Lamb, the famous authors and critics who did so much to popularize the plays of William Shakespeare. Verily, there are ghosts in this temple, beyond the reach of bombs, ghosts that will always live in the memory of mankind. Perhaps the most extreme example of wartime destruction in London may be seen in the vicinity of St. Paul's Cathedral, where entire city blocks were completely bombed out. And now we behold the miracle of the London Blitz. St. Paul's Cathedral, standing upright amidst the ruins around it, standing as it has stood for almost 3 centuries. Although there is great tragedy in these ruins, the ultimate consequence will be a brighter and better London, into which more sunshine will enter to dispel the sinister shadows of war. Never again will the decrepit old buildings that once crowded out the majestic Cathedral of St. Paul mar the setting, for it is the plan of the city fathers to build anew with respect for this shrine. A somewhat poetic sidelight on this depressing scene is the colorful wildflowers that grow out of the ashes. It is said that flowers like these have not been seen in London since the Great Fire in 1666. Consequently, they are now referred to as London fireflowers. They too soften the scars of war and symbolize the spirit of the new life that is now filtering into London. This grand old edifice, standing like something resurrected from the dead, is a symbol of the resurrection that is destined to come to all of the buildings of London that were destroyed by war. But we feel that no modern construction will be able to surpass this architectural wonder, which is probably the outstanding landmark of the British Empire. Within its sacred tombs lie buried many of the illustrious dead of Britain, but it is to the living that St. Paul's now offers greatest consolation, hope and faith in things that are here and greater things that are destined to come. The regal pomp of yesterday has returned to London with all its colorful tradition, and the Lord Mayor on this occasion is host to the first British expeditionary force that distinguished itself in the War of 1914, at which time these men made such an impression on the Kaiser during the Battle of the Marne that he referred to them as contemptible. And they have proudly kept the name ever since. Such is the spirit that is British. And now let us go for a ride down Piccadilly, where life has taken on a post-war feeling, and the whirl of old London is beginning to assert itself again. Here in Piccadilly Circus, the hub of the British Empire, one may find a conglomeration of peoples representing every color, creed, and nationality in the world. During the war, millions of Allied soldiers passed this way, en route to and from the battlefronts of the world. And while in transit, they presented a spectacle that will never be forgotten in the annals of old Piccadilly. And when the sun shines in Piccadilly, a little touch of the spirit of Paris intrudes itself, foreign and unusual. Getting back to the traditional, we are inspired by the significance of this institution, in which the Houses of Parliament meet. It covers 8 acres, has 1,100 rooms, 100 staircases, and 2 miles of passages. Aside from material proportions, however, we are most impressed by the fact that this is the seat of the supreme government of the British Empire, the mother of parliaments and free nations, elected by universal suffrage, the model for the whole world of representative institutions, the last word in democracy. And while we're on the subject of democracy, it is fitting that we should turn our attention now to a solitary monument that stands within the shadow of the Houses of Parliament and also symbolizes Britain's appreciation for the champions of democracy in all countries. Abraham Lincoln, the American rail splitter who brought freedom to 3 million slaves. The great Tower of London, dating back through 9 centuries to the days of William the Conqueror, is another survivor of the war. In conclusion, we rejoice that most of the cherished old landmarks and institutions of London have escaped the horrors of war, for without them, the civilized world would be deprived of a priceless heritage. And it is with this thought that we now conclude our impressions of post-war London. Ship ahoy, with a heave and a hoe. We've just hoisted anchor in the harbor of Halifax at Nova Scotia, and we're out to sea again, the first time since the World War curtailed civilian travel to Europe. The good ship upon which we sail is the Scythia, one of the best in the Atlantic service, with a praiseworthy record for transporting thousands of troops from country to country during the most trying years of the war. It seems like old times to breathe the balmy salt air again and bask in the peaceful diversions of an ocean voyage. But we have not entirely escaped the aftermath of war, for among the passengers on board there are about 150 evacuee children, homeward bound after an absence of several years from their native land. Most of these youngsters, many of whom were infants when they were sent from Great Britain to America at the outbreak of hostilities in Europe, have become so accustomed to living in Canada and the United States that they have changed their native accents, manners, and viewpoints. And undoubtedly, their parents will have an interesting experience in getting them back into their former way of living, if such a thing is possible in Britain or anywhere else in this modern world, a world that has temporarily abandoned the spirit of old lang syne and is apparently trying to shape some new kind of life with utter disregard for the sentimental traditions of yesteryears. At the port of Liverpool, most of our evacuee children disembark, and after changing ships, we sail across the Irish Sea and into the North Channel, a distance of about 156 miles, to our port of disembarkation, which is Belfast, capital of Northern Ireland, famed as the cradle of many ocean-going vessels, the United Kingdom's 6th largest port, and the world's leading linen center. On the outskirts of the city, there are farms and country lanes forming an agricultural background for Belfast, a highly industrialized metropolis, with a $3 million city hall built of Portland stone and housing stately rooms and corridors of Greek and Italian marbles. In the central square of the city, we were particularly impressed by the rapid tempo of the people as they hurried to and fro in the fulfillment of their daily chores. Thanks to the warm winds that soften the climate of Belfast, trees and flowers bloom here in all seasons. And the city's botanical gardens are rated among the finest in the world. A few miles from the heart of the city stands the impressive Parliament building, which contains the Senate and House of Commons for Northern Ireland, a gift of the British government. On this auspicious occasion, we are favored with the opportunity of photographing their Majesties, the King and Queen, and Her Royal Highness, the Princess Elizabeth, who are paying a victory visit to their loyal subjects in Northern Ireland. The people of Northern Ireland consider America and the British Empire as two of the world's greatest forces embodying the spirit of free men. They believe life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the rights of all men, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. They, therefore, are strongly united to Britain and her unwritten plan of government, which has evolved slowly through the ages. An empire with a policy of freedom by installments, making it more or less a group of independent dominions that remain a commonwealth of British communities. Though the North Channel and Irish Sea flow between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the same traditional ideas and way of life are shared, which has made Ulstermen tenaciously loyal to their union with Great Britain. Here, their Majesties are greeted by a delegation of noted Ulster officials who have organized a special reception in behalf of former war workers of Belfast, affording them the opportunity of meeting their King and Queen and their Princess Elizabeth on common ground. Born of a Scottish father and an English mother, Queen Elizabeth is the first British woman not of royal rank to marry a British king, since James II married his Lord Chancellor's daughter in 1660. She is highly esteemed as an intelligent, responsible, and capable woman, noted for her charm and simplicity in manners as well as dress. Princess Elizabeth, heir presumptive to the British throne, was about 13 years of age when her country declared war on Germany, and all during the crisis, a considerable portion of her busy hours were devoted to various war services and home defense. Unlike other girls in Britain, the princess officially became of age on her 18th birthday, April 21st, 1944, at which time she ceased to be an individual. She, like her parents, belongs to the nation. Britons can never forget that two of their greatest sovereigns were women, Elizabeth and Queen Victoria. Although King George VI is a rather modest and retiring person by nature, and a family man by preference, he has both courage and humor in his character. During the First World War, he served in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. And on occasions like this, he often meets an old wartime comrade with whom he enjoys reminiscing. Among his varied responsibilities, he is a field marshal in the Army, an admiral of the fleet, and a marshal of the Royal Air Force. The princess now departs to attend a special function arranged in her honor, while her ever-attentive mother waves a fond farewell. Time and time again in the history of Great Britain, we are reminded of how deeply the love of royalty has been embedded in the hearts of all true Britons. And our final glimpse of the present king and queen, surrounded by their beloved subjects, leaves no doubt in our minds regarding the popularity of their majesties in Belfast. And this is the thought that we take with us as we reluctantly say farewell to the capital city of Northern Ireland. 50 years after Columbus discovered America, Spanish explorers first landed on the beautiful coast of California in search of gold, but finding none, they sailed away. Nevertheless, their stories of the land of perpetual summer inspired others to follow them, and in time, California became one of the outstanding states of the nation. Thanks to a network of fine modern railways and unexcelled motor highways, a tour of California is a thrilling travel experience, especially in the springtime, when whole sections of the state are carpeted with wildflowers. The earliest Spanish settlers brought and planted the seeds for this mustard plant, which now grows wild like the famous California poppy, known as the state flower. A plant common to all parts of the state is the lupin, varying from a tiny species in the mountains to larger varieties near the ocean. Although California lupins are of many colors, deep blue, lavender, and purple seem to predominate. Because of unusually fertile soil and a vast amount of sunshine, it is comparatively easy to grow flowers in California, and it is not uncommon to see whole front yards made up of one flower bank after another. Spreading into the foothills of the Santa Monica Mountains is Hollywood, famous as the motion picture center of the world, even though most of the major producing units are not in the Hollywood district, but are scattered through the outlying areas. Hollywood Boulevard is the main thoroughfare, as well as the central business and amusement district. The scene of most of Hollywood's super world premieres is Grauman's Chinese Theater, where stars and film executives attend opening performances of new films with a ballyhoo of searchlights, microphones, and loudspeakers. The availability of world-famous talent has helped to make Hollywood an important radio center from which many worldwide broadcasts originate. The stars and personalities connected with the motion picture industry are largely responsible for influencing the birth of many interesting ideas, customs, and businesses in Hollywood, many of which are as fantastic as the pictures dreamed up in the land of make-believe. Among the unique business enterprises is the farmer's market. It was originated in 1934 with only a few farmers and merchants. But the venture proved so successful that it has now become a 90-unit marketplace where there are stalls selling almost everything under the sun, a complete shopping center which serves over 35,000 customers daily. Aside from shops, it has a laundry service, a post office, and a railway express office, and also provides accommodations for the payment of public utility bills and income taxes. The fruit stalls are always a source of colorful delight to shoppers as well as spectators. We are told that about half of the fresh fruit consumed in the United States comes from California. Incidentally, agriculture is the basic industry of the state, and its production costs are said to be more than triple that of its fabulous motion picture industry. Lunch here consists of choice delicacies, which are selected at the various food stands and taken to the outdoor tables of the restaurant, patterned after the sidewalk cafes of Paris. In extreme contrast to this enterprise is Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, one of the most unique cemeteries in the world, employing over 600 workers, all pledged to making the institution which they serve a beautiful resting place for the dead, as well as an inspiring source of consolation to the living. Among the park's interesting statues are the Finding of Moses, a reproduction of the original by Brazza, and the Mystery of Life, an original executed in marble by Ernesto Cazzeri, who spent most of his life in its making. There are 3 non-denominational churches in the park. The Wee Kirk of the Heather, a reconstruction of Annie Laurie's church in Scotland. The Little Church of the Flowers, inspired by that of Stoke Poges, England, and the Church of the Recessional, which is a reproduction of the parish church of St. Margaret in Rottingdean, England, and was built as a memorial to the life and works of Rudyard Kipling. Over 15,000 weddings have taken place in the churches of Forest Lawn, and in unique association with them stands the romantic ring of Aldith, to which an old Saxon legend attaches a prophecy of happiness and devotion for those who clasp hands through the ring and repeat together the inscribed vow, "Thy hand in mine, this ring doth bind, my heart to thine." Forest Lawn's founder prefers to be known simply as the Builder. Deciding that most cemeteries were depressing, he abolished headstones in favor of bronze tablets and formulated the Builder's Creed, which expresses his belief in a happy, eternal life and his pledge to build a great park devoid of misshapen monuments and other customary signs of earthly death, but filled with the magnificence of nature, harmonizing with the noble works of mankind. In the Mausoleum's Memorial Court of Honor is the world-famous Rosa Caselli Moretti recreation in stained glass of Leonardo da Vinci's painting, The Last Supper. It took 7 years to complete and is probably the outstanding art contribution of the present generation to posterity. The figures are double life-size, and they are illuminated by natural light, which is controlled by rear shutters, thereby giving changing effects to this masterpiece as each hour of daylight passes. On the summit of Mount Forest Lawn, before the majestic Tower of Legends, where Easter sunrise services are held to commemorate the resurrection of Christ, we most reluctantly conclude our glimpses of California. At the International Airport of San Jose, in a fertile valley about 4,000 feet above sea level, the plane in which we travel stops to call on Costa Rica, second smallest of the American republics, located between the countries of Panama and Nicaragua. This is the terminal station in Central America for the various airways operating between North and South America, and it is regarded as one of the best in the world. The passengers who come and go from here are an interesting conglomeration of people representing practically every race, color, and creed in the world. A few miles from here, we visit the capital city, which has a population of about 70,000 inhabitants. Unlike many important cities of Latin America, San Jose was not founded until long after the Spanish conquest. It became the capital of Costa Rica in 1823. There is a unique story in the history of Costa Rica about the American filibuster, William Walker, who, with the help of a gang of brigands, made himself dictator of Nicaragua and then attempted the conquest of Costa Rica. He was defeated and shot, but the United States paid Costa Rica an indemnity of $26,704 because of Walker's activities. This unique monument commemorates the victory over Walker's unsuccessful attempt to make himself dictator of Central America. Since the hectic days of William Walker, Costa Rica has had few revolutions, and most of them have been bloodless. Until recent years, the country had 6 times as many teachers as soldiers, and more than a third of its receipts were spent to improve the life of the working man. In the suburbs of San Jose may be found municipal golf courses and swimming pools, where one may enjoy the more wholesome diversions of life in peaceful seclusion. The Spaniards who first occupied Costa Rica came from northern Spain, and they were not so much conquistadores as farmers, settlers, and family men. Their pure-blooded descendants, now representing over 80% of the country's population, are a living tribute to their memory. Modern Costa Rican girls in particular are noted for their culture, intelligence, and personality. It is said there are more varieties of orchids in Costa Rica than in any other country. And although we didn't take time to verify this, we visited the farm of a famous orchid grower, where we found some outstanding examples, which may help to substantiate Costa Rica's claim to orchid fame. These delicately beautiful flowers are the most complex in the floral family, and the art of developing them from wild species into cultured varieties is a supreme achievement. Over 15,000 species and varieties are known throughout the world. Although Costa Rica is noted for its modern highways, this quaint transportation system is still in vogue, and no small amount of the country's produce is transported in this manner. The farmers vie with each other in decorating their handmade carts, the wheels of which often look like the tops of roulette tables. Even the wooden bars that are strapped to the horns of the oxen receive their share of the painted decorations. Although the traffic may be antique, the roads of Costa Rica are among the best in the world, and this little country boasts that it is one of the first to complete its portion of the great Pan-American Highway. Among the scenic marvels of Costa Rica are her volcanoes, the best known of which are Poas, 9,000 feet above sea level, and possessing the largest crater in the world, and its sister volcano, Iratsu, dominating the central plateau of the country. In this barren region, the mighty forces of nature have been churning the depths of the earth for countless ages. And although we are probably gazing on the oldest land in this part of the world, we have the strange feeling of witnessing evolution at work, molding new land in the ceaseless forge of nature. In 1502, when Columbus landed on the shores of this country, he christened it Costa Rica, meaning rich coast. But it is not the wealth of gold and silver and other valuable mineral deposits which makes Costa Rica a rich country, for mining has not been developed as a dominant industry, and the continued economic prosperity of the country is dependent upon its plantations and small farms. Next to coffee, bananas are the chief crop of export, and the investment in banana plantations is valued at over $23 million. Costa Rica was the first Central American nation to export bananas to the British Isles and Europe. This region was once a dense tropical forest, which has now succumbed to the developing hand of man. Water chemists locate supplies of water for irrigating the plants. Although about 3/4 of all American banana lands are in heavy rainfall zones, new modes in cultivation demand even more water. And in widespread use is this banana irrigation system, whereby the equivalent of 2 inches of rainfall every week is sprayed on the groves. The banana's scientific name is Musa sapientum, meaning fruit of the wise men. The Koran calls it the tree of paradise. But the banana does not grow on a tree. It is the harvest of the largest terrestrial plants, completely lacking a woody stem. A semi-bulbous plant with a leaf structure somewhat similar to that of the ordinary garden canna. The true stem is underground. It is a crop that cannot be ripened successfully on the plant, and the harvest must be cut green. On the modern banana plantation, routines of planting and pruning are such that the fruit can be cut for market every week and virtually every calendar day of the year, thereby making it a perpetual harvest. A hill comes into bearing within 12 months after planting, and one hill frequently produces about 2 bunches a year for as many as 25 or 30 consecutive years. At the loading stations, the bananas are thoroughly cleansed and purified before packing them into cars, which start them on their long journey into the banana markets of the world. And so life goes on in this banana realm, where a fruit that was practically unheard of in northern countries a century ago is now a staple food in the diet of mankind. Although the backs of mules and donkeys are still an important medium for transporting bananas, they are fast being transplanted by modern trucks, which can carry in one load enough bananas to put 100 donkeys to shame. Back at the airport in San Jose, our plane is waiting to transport us to our northern homes, 3,000 miles away. Just a short journey in this modern age, which has reduced distances and boundaries to such an extent that a weekend trip today could mean a complete swing around the world. are in the state of California, upon which Mother Nature has lavished such a diversity of topography that we may find within its boundaries a scenic resemblance to almost any part of the entire world. These sand dunes in the southeastern corner of the state, not unlike the deserts of Egypt, have provided natural backgrounds for many motion pictures. But long before the advent of film productions, a wooden road was built here to carry prospectors by stagecoach to the newly discovered gold fields in Arizona. And this is a typical section of all that is left of that old wooden road. In contrast to this wooden relic is the modern highway which now spans the rolling sand dunes between California and Arizona, where the All-American Canal winds its way like a miniature Nile, bringing life and fertility to the former wastelands of the desert. For ages, this desert was non-productive until the genius of man discovered the power of scientific irrigation. And here is an excellent example of the results obtained. The vineyards of California produce about 90% of the grapes grown in the United States and over 50% of the wine consumed by the nation. Another picturesque product of the reclaimed desert is the date palm, a species of tree directly descended from palms that lived centuries ago in Palestine, Arabia, and Egypt. Although the annual crop of the date trees is a most profitable one, the ornamental value of the tree seems to be of greater importance to the people of Southern California, who enjoy its beauty and its shade. Here in Beverly Hills, one of the outstanding residential cities of the state, we are intrigued by the novelty of sightseeing on bicycles. During the war, thousands of soldiers and sailors were among those who had the pleasure of seeing their favorite movie stars' homes from the seats of bicycles. And credit for this is due largely to a patriotic citizen of the community who supplied the bicycles, one Hans Ort, the cycle king of the West, who has become famous for his unique cycle tours in the land of the movie stars. Sitting on the front seat of his favorite quadricycle with Mrs. Ort and two other colorfully dressed passengers merrily pedaling behind him, Hans Ort, a descendant of old Denmark, where bicycles are as numerous as men, commands the most unique position among the unique people of Hollywood. Aside from the homes of celebrities, he takes particular pride in showing off the public buildings of Beverly Hills, such as the City Hall, and traffic is never too heavy to interfere with his colorful bicycle brigade as it rolls its way along the busiest thoroughfares. For our pleasure, however, we prefer the more peaceful avenues in the shade of the sheltering palms. Although Spanish architecture originally dominated the better homes of Southern California, there is now a general assortment of architecture duplicating that of practically every country in the world. Here is a typical example of the English style that has caught the fancy of architects in recent years. And now let us divert our attention to the more open country, where ranch life reminds us somewhat of Argentina, Brazil, or Spain. And speaking of Spain, it is fitting that a few words may be spoken here in behalf of the old Spanish families that originally settled in California, including the Carrillo family, from whom descended a gentleman who has become world famous as an actor, Leo Carrillo, the owner of this ranch. On his Rancho de los Quixotes, Mr. Carrillo has endeavored to maintain the traditions of his ancestry, and foremost among these is hospitality. As our genial host, he invites us to visit him, and we are greeted with a typical Spanish embrazo. Aside from his fame as an actor, Mr. Carrillo is a most interesting personality, keenly absorbed in the civic affairs of his native state, the history of which is one of his favorite subjects. That evening, as we sat on the veranda of the Rancho Quixotes, gazing at this glorious sunset, we listened to the stories of old California as told by our host, and somehow they all seemed to blend into the color and the mood of the setting sun. although there is joy in natural beauty as it spreads itself over the earth. To us, the real travel thrill in any land comes from those who say welcome and farewell. And outstanding among them is Leo Carrillo of the Rancho Quixotes, who sincerely says bienvenidos when we arrive and adios, amigos, when we depart. With the history of old California still in our thoughts, we now visit the very heart of Los Angeles, where the city itself was founded by the early Spanish pioneers in 1781. It was around this typical plaza that the first homes of the Spanish aristocracy were built, as well as what is now the oldest church in the city. Not far from here is a district known as Chinatown, one of the most interesting of the foreign quarters in Los Angeles. This exotic community caters to thousands of tourists who find in its shops and bazaars everything from precious Chinese art to cheap trinkets, curios, and cocktails. The local Chinese population here is over 3,000, most of whom are descendants of pioneers who came to California in the gold rush days. Women in the dress of old China rub elbows with those frantically following the latest Occidental fashion. Their religion, however, remains the same as that of their ancestors, and they still worship the same Oriental gods the Chinese have been worshiping for thousands of years. In California, the distance from China to Mexico is only a matter of minutes, and here we are in the Mexican quarter known as Olvera Street. Considering the fact that the city of Los Angeles has a population of several thousand Mexicans, it is only natural that there should be at least one street in the ancient Puebla that is traditionally Mexican, and it is largely for this reason that Olvera Street is perpetuated. Perhaps the most interesting features are the picturesque costumes and attitudes of the native vendors, as well as the ever-present musicians. This unique street was named after a popular Mexican hero, Don Olvera, who defended old California against the Yankee invaders, the descendants of whom now shop here peacefully enjoying things Mexican. Among the featured articles for sale are serapes, sombreros, baskets, colorful ornaments, and all kinds of pottery, most of which is made in this manner. The potter's wheel was among the first mechanical inventions of primitive man, and it is still in practical use in many parts of the world, turning out vessels in clay that are not unlike those that were molded thousands of years ago. And so time passes in Olvera Street, where yesterday blends with today, and the spirit of song is ever present. And so time limits us to just a few of the many international impressions to be had from a journey around the world in California. We are sailing into the harbor of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, where the masted schooners of yesteryear are still in active service, plying their trade principally throughout the British Empire. Lunenburg is the home port for one of the world's best deep sea fishing fleets, and most of the schooners used in this service were built here, including the famous Blue Nose, undefeated champion of the North Atlantic fishing fleet and winner of 4 international schooner races. The town itself dates back several hundred years when it was the site of an Indian encampment and afterwards a French fishery settlement. About the middle of the 18th century, it was settled and named by a large number of families that migrated here from Lüneburg, Germany. We have visited most of the harbors in the world, but nowhere do we remember having seen so many masted schooners assembled together for practical use as here at Lüneburg. The province of Nova Scotia is well situated in the largest of the world's great fishing areas, and it is also favored with an abundant supply of good timber. Consequently, shipbuilding has always been one of its most important industries. The men of Nova Scotia not only build their ships, but they also go down to the sea in them. And by family tradition and experience, they are as daring as they are skillful. Although they specialize in the building of fishing schooners, now and then they turn out pleasure craft that is also a credit to their skill. The numerous waterways of Nova Scotia are ideal for good sailing, especially in the vicinity of Bridgewater, on the La Have or the La Have River, which is particularly noted for its ideal yachting conditions. A few miles from here, where the Petite Riviere flows into Green Bay, we are rewarded with a panorama of scenic beauty typical of Nova Scotia. And we are told that we are now looking down upon one of the world's most prolific fishing areas, where tuna weighing 800 pounds and more are not unusual. It is claimed that all world record tuna catches during the past 36 years have been made in the coastal waters of Nova Scotia. For those who prefer light tackle angling, there are numerous inland waterways abounding in a variety of gamey fish, including the ever-sportive Atlantic salmon. In these post-war days, when so many soldiers are returning to civilian life with physical handicaps, it is interesting to note how these handicaps are overcome, as illustrated here by a one-armed fisherman who baits a hook and casts a line as well, if not better, than any of his two-armed contemporaries. In the human scheme of things, there are a few diversions that are universal, and outstanding among these is the sport of fishing, which has encircled the globe since time and fish began. And none but a fisherman can understand or appreciate the thrill of bringing in a fighting fish. Old Isaac Walton, whose superb story of the complete angler has never been excelled, even though it was written 3 centuries ago, has given to the sport of fishing a halo of poetry that eulogizes the men who fish, as well as the settings in which they fish. Usually, when we set up our cameras in the hope of photographing the catching of a fish, nothing happens. But on this occasion, we are rewarded with an actual catch. And here it is, a sparkling silver Atlantic salmon. Over 8,000 salmon were caught in the streams of Nova Scotia last year by visiting anglers, and April, May, and June appear to be the most prolific months. Now let's get around to a little commercial fishing, which is carried on in a unique manner by the boys of Nova Scotia. They are catching a prolific but choice species of fish that finds a ready sale in the markets. And it is not unusual for a boy to scoop up 100 or more of these fish in a few hours during the height of the season. A few miles from here, we visit a peaceful little fishing village known as Blue Rocks, noted for its lobster industry. Nova Scotia claims the world's record for the production of lobsters, no small amount of which are caught in the waters immediately adjacent to these villages. Lobsters caught here have weighed as much as 35 pounds. Unfortunately, the season ended before our arrival, and all that is left for us to see in connection with lobsters are the wooden traps that have been neatly stored for next season. Lobsters usually walk about the bottom of the sea in shallow places, and these traps, baited with food, are used to catch them. The scenic beauty of Nova Scotia and the fascinating subjects found along her shores have made this land a haven for photographers and artists, one of the most unusual and talented of whom is Earl Bailey. A native of Nova Scotia, Mr. Bailey lost the use of feet and hands at the age of 3 years through an attack of infantile paralysis. Through his great courage and optimism, he taught himself to paint and goes on teaching those who meet him that regardless of how physically incapacitated or handicapped a man may be, there is always a chance to do something interesting and useful if the will to accomplish is of sufficient strength. Not alone for the unusual manner in which his work is executed, but for artistic merit, his paintings in watercolors and oils have always won a great deal of well-deserved admiration and praise and found ready purchasers. But aside from the merit of his paintings, we are inspired by the beauty of his soul, which tends to minimize our unjustified complaints and sends us on our way with a more noble regard for men like Earl Bailey. At Peggy's Cove, another popular resort for artists, the shoreline of the province continues with its unending picturesqueness. But it is time now for us to end our journey, and it is with great reluctance that we say, farewell to the shores of Nova Scotia. This is Halifax, capital and largest city in the province of Nova Scotia, as well as Canada's greatest Atlantic port. It was founded by the British in 1749. Having one of the finest natural harbors in the world, Halifax has played an important role in the history of nautical trade, and in time of war it has risen to degrees of importance beyond the capacity of the city itself. The northwest arm of the harbor is regarded as one of the world's best saltwater inlets for aquatic sports. The most conspicuous landmark in Halifax is the old clock tower on Citadel Hill, which has been clocking away the hours since the year of 1800, when Citadel Hill was regarded as the strongest fortification in America. The diversions of the people of Nova Scotia are generally simple and wholesome, and a little cottage like this, beside a fishing stream, is always an unfailing source of peaceful pleasure. Acadia University at Wolfville, founded by the Baptist Education Society, and King's Collegiate School at Windsor are typical of the finer schools in the province. Nova Scotia, or New Scotland, is so Scottish that even her native Indians are called Micmacs, and the proverbial Highland kilt is still a popular costume, particularly at King's College. Although the descendants of Scotland represent a large majority of the population in Nova Scotia, there are many of French descent, their ancestry dating back to Grand Pré, the land of Evangeline. We are on the site of the village founded here in 1632 by French Acadians, the descendants of whom were expelled in 1755. And this monument commemorates the memory of Evangeline, the lovely heroine of the Acadians, immortalized in the poem by Longfellow. This church is also a tribute to the memory of the Acadians. The apple seeds brought by the early French settlers from Normandy thrive so well that today thousands of acres of Nova Scotia's choicest land abound in apple trees. And in the springtime, when these trees are in full bloom, They remind us of apple blossom time in Normandy. This region is known as the apple barrel of eastern Canada, and it boasts of having the largest aggregation of apple orchards in the British Empire. In an average year, Nova Scotia produces about 1.25 million barrels of apples, 75% of which go to the British Isles. This fruit being the largest agricultural export, it is only natural that there should be an apple blossom festival to commemorate the annual miracle of the blossoming of the trees. With all peoples throughout the world, there has been a natural appreciation for bountiful harvests, and the beauty of the fruitful trees that blossom has always been a source of inspiration and delight. In this simple little ceremony, the people of the community have assembled here to express their gratitude to the giver of all good gifts, who has blessed their land with fruitful seasons and happy homes. Nova Scotia is particularly noted for its variety of churches, in which practically all the creeds of mankind are represented. Here in the little town of Mahone Bay alone, there are 5 churches, and it is an impressive experience on a Sunday to hear the sounds of their bells pealing out over the bay. At Lunenburg, there is an unusually interesting old wooden structure known as St. John's Anglican Church, built in 1754 by the British government, under the sponsorship of which it was dedicated. Inside this unique little church, one may see memorial windows that are on a par with the best in the world, and here is a beautiful example. Proud of its history, Nova Scotia has endeavored to reconstruct and preserve its historical landmarks, such as this fort, known as Port Royal Habitation, reconstructed on its original site, a replica of the colonizing settlement which was built in 1605 under the leadership of the first governor of Port Royal. The well in the center is a duplicate of an original that was dug here centuries ago by the first French settlers. The oak shingled cover with the windlass and bucket are all made by hand and reminiscent of old Normandy. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth Rock, a thriving village had stood here on the shores of the Annapolis Basin, which was then the Port Royal or Royal Harbor of the French. From the time of its founding until its capitulation in 1710, it changed hands many times between the French and the British. The first act of the final conquerors was to change the name from Port Royal to Annapolis Royal, in honor of the then reigning sovereign of Great Britain, Queen Anne. This fort is an exact reproduction of the original that once stood here. And these cannon date back to the wars between the French and the British. On the western shore of the Annapolis Basin, about 150 miles from Halifax, we visit the port of Digby, home of one of the world's great scallop fleets. The town overlooks a body of water that leads into the Bay of Fundy, which is noted for its extreme tides and treacherous navigation. In the open oceans, the rise and fall of the tides averages 2 to 3 feet. Along the coast, it is usually larger, while in shallow bays or estuaries of rivers, the range may be enormous, varying from 50 to 70 feet, as in the Bay of Fundy, where the world's highest and lowest tides have been recorded. The rivers that flow into the Bay of Fundy are also noted for their extreme tides, rising or falling as much as 50 feet. The reason for this is due to the formation of the land in which the Bay of Fundy rests. But scientific phenomena does not concern the youngsters of Nova Scotia so much as the thrill which they get out of sliding down the slippery mud banks created by the fast ebbing tides. Large freighters that float in the rivers at high tide sink to their special cradles which have been constructed on the muddy harbor floor at low tide. And so goes the unceasing roll of time and tide in this part of the world, where all the wondrous elements of nature have combined to create a most interesting province on the colorful coast of eastern Canada. From out of the morning haze looms the metropolis of Roanoke, the third largest city in Virginia. Much could be said here about the illustrious history of the Old Dominion state and its famous cities, such as modern Roanoke, built upon the very ground over which marched the armies of the North and South during the Civil War, and Richmond, the largest city and capital of the state, where the Capitol buildings represent the oldest legislative assembly in the Western Hemisphere, and where Patrick Henry, the illustrious orator of the American Revolutionary War, made his impassioned plea for liberty or death. Verily, much has been said about all this, but the purpose of our visit now is to see something of the industries which help to develop and sustain the state of Virginia. The first of these is tobacco, and it is fitting that we should begin this sequence at Danville, the tobacco center of the state. A considerable portion of Virginia's best tobacco is grown by independent farmers on comparatively small plots of land. Here, the precious leaves are being prepared for the drying barns. The cultivation of tobacco requires unusual skill, for it is subjected not only to the regular hazards of agriculture, but it is a crop that can be completely spoiled by a few moments of inattention or carelessness. After it is picked, leaf by leaf, it is cured or dried until the leaves are a bright yellow color, a very delicate process which takes place in the tobacco barn. Virginia has always been a farming state, and its present-day prosperity and welfare depend largely upon the soundness of its agricultural development. Although it has vast plantations upon which all the modern innovations of farming are in practice, our interest centers around the independent farmer, who still clings to old-fashioned methods and seems to be content with the simple privilege of working his own land on his own time and in his own way. More power to him. This undying spirit of independence is one of long standing in the Old Dominion state. And humble though it may be in this particular case, it reflects a praiseworthy heritage that is fundamentally American. Here, the one man and a mule outfit is producing sorghum, or molasses, which is obtained by pressing the juice from a species of sugar cane and boiling it. A unique method, not unlike that which served the ancient Egyptians thousands of years ago. One of the most important agricultural achievements in the state of Virginia is the cultivation of peanuts, planted in April or May and usually harvested in October. Aside from farmers, few people seem to realize that peanuts grow underground like potatoes. An average plant attains a height of 18 inches, and a single vine may bear from 25 to 50 nuts. After the vines are plowed up, they are shaken from the soil and then stacked on a pole for curing, allowing the wind to blow through them for several weeks, as the shells are soft and damp when dug. The peanuts are then picked from the vines either by hand or by machine pickers, such as we see here, the debris being blown away by fans. About 200 million pounds of peanuts are used annually in the production of peanut butter alone. And in addition to this, peanuts are used for making candy, edible oil, lubricating oil, gasoline, dyes, cosmetics, and other things too numerous to mention. The peanut was brought to America in the early part of the 18th century, and its value now exceeds $100 million annually in the United States. For a long time after the first settlers reached Virginia, the tidal waterways and rivers afforded the most satisfactory means of transportation in the eastern part of the state. And these waters are still used by a conglomeration of boats for commerce and pleasure. Here, too, independent endeavor finds itself among the fishermen, who own their own boats and depend upon the products of the sea for their livelihood. No visit to Virginia would be complete without a trip to Natural Bridge, which is regarded as one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. Before the white man came to America, the Indians worshipped this ancient wonder and called it the Bridge of God. In 1774, Thomas Jefferson bought it from King George III of England for 20 shillings. And he predicted even then that Natural Bridge would be a world-famous attraction. In this subterranean realm, discovered in 1878, one experiences a feeling of mute wonder and reverence for the great Creator and the quaint and superb handiwork of nature, carved in solid stone. At some period long subsequent to its original excavation, and after many large stalactites had grown, the caverns were completely filled with glacial mud, charged with acid, whereby the dripstone was eroded into singularly grotesque shapes and colors. After the mud had been mostly removed by flowing water, these eroded forms remained amid the new growths. When the cave was first entered, the floor was covered with thousands of tracks made by wild animals, many of them of prehistoric origin. Traces of human occupation were also discovered, leading geologists to believe that Luray Caverns may have sheltered primitive cavemen long before the dawn of civilization. The caverns, containing nearly 3 miles of underground passage, are internationally famous, attracting almost 200,000 visitors each year. There are no streams or true springs in the caverns, but there are hundreds of basins varying from 6 inches to 15 feet in depth. The water in them is crystal clear, exquisitely pure, and completely devoid of animal life. By way of tribute to this marvel of creation, at Easter time, a church choir marches through the caverns, effectively singing their alleluias to the Lord, Creator of heaven and earth and all things, great and small. at Mount Vernon in the state of Virginia, where George Washington brought his bride in 1759 and made his home with her during 40 years of the most trying times in the history of a new nation, which was then being cradled. Washington inherited this estate in his early youth, and except for his absences as Commander-in-Chief of the armies of the Revolution and as first President of the United States, he lived here until the day of his death as a Virginia planter with all the stately and romantic traditions of the Old South. He died December 14th, 1799, and his ever-devoted wife, Martha, joined him in death 3 years later. Their mortal remains now lie at rest in this simple tomb, not far from the house in which they lived. Among the paintings that hang on the walls of the illustrious shrine at Mount Vernon are that of George Washington, painted in the final years of his life, and that of his wife, Martha Washington. This painting is perhaps the most famous of all that have been made to commemorate the memory of the man who was first in peace, first in war, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. To George Washington, the Freemason, this Masonic National Memorial Temple has been erected in Alexandria at a cost of $5 million, contributed by 3 million Masons. Outstanding among the many famous Virginians is General Robert E. Lee, who was born in this house on January 19, 1807. In the whole history of chivalrous warfare, no soldier has distinguished himself more than the man who once resided here. True to his native state, General Lee sincerely fought for what proved to be a lost cause. At Monticello, or Monticello, near Charlottesville, we visit the home of Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States and author of the American Declaration of Independence. This unique residence was designed by Jefferson, who also invented many clever devices which are still in use, such as dumb waiters, disappearing beds, and unusual lighting and ventilating systems. Although he had slaves on his estate who resided in these quarters, he was the author of the first American anti-slavery bill, which failed to pass in Congress. This serpentine wall, built on the grounds of the University of Virginia, is another invention attributed to the genius of Thomas Jefferson. It is built on a curved line for added strength and more artistic design. In 1819, Jefferson founded the University of Virginia, and here, too, we find evidence of his architectural skill. Not only was he the builder, he was the rector of the Board of Visitors, the administrator, and dominating power of the institution until the day of his death. Beautifully situated upon an elevation in Lexington stands the Washington and Lee University, endowed by George Washington and rehabilitated by Robert E. Lee, who became president of this institution shortly after the Civil War. Not far from here is the Virginia Military Institute, established in 1839 and known as the West Point of the South. Although the students are under rigid military discipline, they have their romantic hours of leisure. The Institute occupies nearly 40 buildings, of which the 7 largest are furnished with battlements. The courses are designed essentially to train young men in the various fields of civic endeavor, and military instruction simply augments the course of training. It was from this institution that General Stonewall Jackson, who was a member of the faculty, led the Corps of Cadets in 1861 to help train the Southern Army, which was then assembled in Richmond. story of the birth of a nation would be complete without a visit to colonial Williamsburg, recently restored through the generosity and patriotism of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., making it a lively reincarnation of the busy and important colonial capital, which was moved here from Jamestown in 1699. The old courthouse, commendably restored, is now used as a museum. It was from this so-called powder magazine that the last British governor ordered the removal of public arms and ammunition, thereby helping to provoke the Revolutionary War in Virginia. The Bruton Parish Church is said to be the oldest Episcopal church of uninterrupted use in America. The governor's palace, completed in 1720, stood as a symbol of royal authority and prestige in Virginia, and was first the residence of a succession of men who governed the British colony for the crown, then served as the executive mansion of the first two governors of the Virginia Commonwealth, Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, thereby sharing in the beginning of a dignified democracy. Social recognition at the palace was the near equivalent of acceptance at court in England, and the parties, balls, and entertainments here were probably more elegant and impressive than elsewhere in the colonies at the time. The governor's palace was the center of fashion and social life in colonial Williamsburg. In the restoration of the gardens, it was possible to employ methods of documentary and archaeological research, similar to those employed in the reconstruction of the building itself. The restored Capitol is a counterpart of the original building, completed on the same foundations in 1705. The flag of Great Britain, now flying peacefully over this building, a copy of the obsolete flag of the 18th century, is a far cry from that day at Yorktown, when Lord Cornwallis surrendered his defeated British army here on this very ground to General Washington, thereby terminating the Revolutionary War and establishing the United States as a free and independent nation. It is fitting that this momentous event took place in Virginia, the old Dominion state, the boundaries of which once extended to the southeastern border of Canada and embraced what is now a dozen or more states. Virginia, where the Jamestown Monument commemorates a significant event in history, where the hardships and romantic adventures of the Jamestown colonists are perpetuated by statues of Pocahontas, the Indian princess who saved the life of Captain John Smith, the heroic savior of the Jamestown colony. Virginia, land of great men and great deeds, we salute you as the cradle of a nation. About a mile from the mainland of Nova Scotia, the eastern outpost of Canada, lies Cape Breton Island, where approximately 140,000 people live a somewhat secluded but progressive life, depending largely on agriculture, fishing, and mining for their livelihood. It is believed that this historic old island was discovered and named by Basque fishermen who crossed the Atlantic in search of whales more than a century before Columbus discovered America. And there is stronger evidence that John and Sebastian Cabot landed here in 1497. Cape Breton is 110 miles long and about 80 miles wide. And thanks to a network of very good roads, a complete tour of the island is only a matter of a few days. We are now traveling in the region of the Bras-d'Or Lakes. When the French pioneers first looked upon these waters, it must have been in the golden light of the setting sun, suggesting to them the name of Bras d'Or, or Arms of Gold. Although the French pioneers may have been responsible for naming many of the old landmarks, including Cape Breton itself, and although there is still a small French colony on the island, the majority of the inhabitants are of Scottish descent. Outstanding among the famous Scotsmen associated with Cape Breton was Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, as well as many other useful things. Dr. Bell lived for several years in this little community known as Bedeck, and he conducted many of his experiments here. It was from the frozen waters of this lake in the winter of 1909 that an airplane built under Dr. Bell's supervision took off on the first flight in the British Empire. The town hall of Bedeck houses many interesting old relics that have been found at various times around the island, and the town clerk, or the town clerk as he calls himself, proudly exhibits a few interesting examples for us. In his opinion, this sword once belonged to the Cabots. And he also believes this miniature cannon was once in the possession of the early explorers of Cape Breton. Although we cannot prove the authenticity of these relics, we will vouch for the sincerity and enthusiasm of the local historian, who is a great credit to his community. Not far from the town of Bedeck stands the house in which Alexander Graham Bell spent his summers for many years prior to his death. Here, the great inventor enjoyed the waning years of his life with his devoted wife, and among their favorite haunts was this woodland lane through which they once strolled hand in hand. Privileged visitors may now traverse the romantic lane which leads to the summit of the hill overlooking the broad expanse of lakes, where Mr. and Mrs. Bell often sat and watched the setting sun, and where, in keeping with their wishes, their mortal remains now lie at rest. A modest tribute to one of the world's greatest inventors. Continuing our journey, we pass through the Margaree Valley, one of the scenic highlights of the Cabot Trail. The Margaree River is only one of Nova Scotia's 40 prolific salmon streams, and here the fishing is at its best in late August and September. Aside from fishing, world-renowned artists have found inspiration in the colorful settings through which the waters of Nova Scotia flow. Farm settings that look as though they were designed for paintings rather than the products of agriculture for which this region is noted. Owing to its numerous rivers and lakes, Cape Breton has a ferry boat system which keeps traffic moving in a rather unique manner. Although it's just a short journey, the old skipper takes his job very seriously, feeling as much responsibility for each crossing as would the captain of an Atlantic steamship. One of the attractions along the Cabot Trail is the grave of the famous giant, Angus McAskill, who was 7 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 425 pounds. He toured the world with the equally famous midget, Tom Thumb, and died in 1863 at the age of 38 years. A few miles off the Cabot Trail, we pause to admire a pretty little French maiden who shows us how hook rugs are made. The hook rug business here dates back to the first French settlers on Cape Breton Island, and it is perpetuated today by their descendants, who raise their own sheep and prepare the wool. It takes a good worker 15 days to make a medium-sized bedroom rug. Cape Breton rugs are usually designed with floral patterns or motifs suggesting the sea. This is a copy of the famous Blue Nose, which was built in Nova Scotia and won 3 out of 5 contests for the International Fisherman's Trophy. Although these rugs may originate in very humble circumstances, they have become internationally famous and may be seen today in all parts of the world. Under the apple blossoms with busy little Alouette and her hooked rugs is a desirable place to linger. But travelers must travel, so we take to the trail again. And our trail leads us over hills and down valleys, across rivers and bridges, under beautiful cloud-laden skies, until we finally arrive at the grand metropolis of Cape Breton Island, the city of Sydney. Sydney was founded in 1785 by British loyalists from New York State, headed by a former mayor of Albany, and it now constitutes the greatest industrial area in Nova Scotia. It has the largest self-contained steel plant in Canada, manufacturing a general assortment of steel products. Its coal mines extend far under the sea, and from them comes the only coal at tidewater on the Atlantic seaboard. Among the other thriving industries of Sydney are woodworking plants, foundries, and machine works, making it a humming city in an attractive setting of sea, lakes, rivers, and historical mementos. And so, as the shadows of twilight begin to fall over this Pittsburgh of Canada, we turn our camera on the setting sun and most reluctantly say, farewell to Cape Breton Island. This is Chicago, queen of the Great Lakes and wonder city of the Middle West, where American enterprise and progressive people have combined to build in less than a century the second largest metropolis in North America. A panorama of its picturesque skyline fronting Michigan Avenue reveals that the city fathers built with an eye for practical stability as well as for beauty of design. We soon learned that Chicago is a city of superlatives, outstanding among which is the Stevens Hotel, the largest in the world, containing 3,000 rooms. Chicago's many fine hotels have been instrumental in making it one of America's foremost convention and tourist cities, there being over 150,000 rooms available within the metropolitan center and several thousand more in the suburban districts. Driving along Michigan Avenue, we passed the Chicago Public Library, containing over 800,000 volumes. And there before us, in all its white majesty, is the world-renowned Wrigley Building. Among the other architectural masterpieces of the city are the Shedd Aquarium, the Chicago Museum of Natural History, formerly known as the Field Museum, and Soldier Field Stadium, built in the classic tradition of ancient Greek and Roman architecture. A boat trip on the Chicago River reveals another thrilling view of the city's great skyscrapers, including the Chicago Tribune building, home of one of the world's leading newspapers, and the Wrigley Tower. Musical appreciation has always been one of Chicago's inherent characteristics, and it is convincingly confirmed by this 42-story building, occupying a whole city block and housing the Civic Opera, in which the world's finest music is featured. And now we come to another superlative, the Merchandise Mart, said to be the largest building of its kind on the face of this earth. Like an artery of life, the Chicago River flows from Lake Michigan through the heart of the city and provides transportation for a continuous procession of boats carrying cargo to and from the Great Lakes. It was along this unassuming waterway that native Indians once paddled their canoes, and early white traders first planted the seeds of commerce that started a growth so fast and stupendous that it has never been equaled in the building of a great metropolis. In addition to commercial shipping, the Chicago River is also a terminus for the palatial pleasure craft that ply the Great Lakes. And here is one just starting out on a summer excursion trip to Benton Harbor, Michigan. So much for boats and the Chicago River. Now let us turn our attention to trains, for Chicago is served by about 40 railroads, making it the largest transportation center in the world. Over 1,500 passenger trains arrive at or depart from Chicago every 24 hours, transporting more than 270,000 passengers. From the observation tower of the Board of Trade building, we look down into the city's canyons of commerce, where many of the world's greatest financial deals are transacted. Gracing the top of the Board of Trade building is the statue of Ceres, goddess of grain, and she proudly presides over the largest and most important grain exchange in the nation. And here is Randolph Street, the Rialto of Chicago, where the modern Bismarck and Sherman hotels mingle with a fascinating and colorful array of fine theaters, dance pavilions, shops, and restaurants of every kind and description, unique among which is this quaint landmark, patterned after medieval Europe's old Heidelberg. And this is State Street, home of the famous Chicago Theater and the celebrated department store, which was founded about 80 years ago by Marshall Field, one of Chicago's pioneer leaders and champions of private enterprise. State Street is regarded as the world's most concentrated retail shopping center. Over $450 million worth of merchandise being sold here annually. We find the center of greatest activity where State crosses Madison Street. We are now gazing upon the Palmer House, one of Chicago's best-known hotels, founded by Potter Palmer, who is credited with being the pioneer father of State Street. And here again is another superlative, claimed to be the tallest hotel in the world, the Morrison, towering 650 feet above street level. On the North Shore Drive, we behold what is known as the Gold Coast, so called because of the wealth that is said to be represented by the people who live in this exclusive section of the city. And now let's go for a ride along the shore of the lake, taking what is known locally as the Outer Drive. At the northern terminus of the Outer Drive stands the renowned Edgewater Beach Hotel, an institution that has long associated itself with the traditions of Chicago hospitality. On our return trip over the same drive, we passed through the Gold Coast section again, where the towering Palm Olive Building and the impressive Drake Hotel form a fitting background for an exclusive bathing beach. Vying with bathing as a popular diversion for the outdoor-loving people of Chicago is the sport of fishing, and this is a common sight all through the fishing season. The lake abounds with perch, herring, and lake trout, and the supply is replenished at yearly intervals. Let those of us who once thought of Chicago as a landlocked metropolis on the parched prairies of the Middle West, far from the cooling breezes of the seven seas, gaze on this evidence to the contrary and realize that Lake Michigan provides Chicago with all the aquatic diversions of the ocean side, and at the same time acts as the air conditioner of the city itself. This modern apartment house forms an interesting contrast with an old landmark that was built at the turn of the last century by Potter Palmer, one of the pioneer merchants and builders of the city. A page from the past, when a man's home was really his castle. And now we come to what is Chicago's most revered landmark, the old water tower, one of the few constructions that survived the Great Fire of 1871, and a silent reminder of the indomitable spirit that built the Chicago of today. The old stone gateway to the stockyards is another landmark, and through its portals now pass the buyers and sellers who trade in the world's largest cattle market. In Jackson Park stands the Fine Arts Building, a survivor of the famous Columbian Exposition, which was held in Chicago in 1893. This beautiful institution is now known as the Museum of Science and Industry. Chicago's proximity to Lake Michigan has naturally made her citizens very boat conscious, and we find many harbors that provide haven for colorful pleasure craft. In one of the picturesque little yacht harbors of Jackson Park, among a variegated array of modern pleasure boats, there is another reminder of the world's Columbian Exposition, and here it is, an exact replica of the Santa Maria, flagship of Christopher Columbus. The Statue of the Republic in Jackson Park is the only sculptural record left to commemorate the memory of the Columbian Exposition. Not far from here stands the famous Fountain of Time, sculptured by Laredo Taft and dedicated in 1922, considered to be the most elaborate and imaginative work of purely ideal sculpture ever executed in this country. Time goes, you say. Ah, no. Alas, time stays. We go. That thought, so well expressed by Austin Dobson, was the inspiration for this masterpiece. And now, in the hour of twilight before the internationally famous Buckingham Fountain, we gaze upon our concluding scene of Chicago. This beautiful creation is the gift of the late Catherine Buckingham, patron of the arts, who also provided for its maintenance in perpetuity. A fitting symbol of the magnanimous spirit that guides the great heart of Chicago, the beautiful. We are in the United Kingdom's Principality of Wales, a land of rolling mountains, green valleys, and rustic homes, where about 2.5 million people live peacefully on about 7,000 square miles of land, pursuing the even tenor of their lives, still clinging tenaciously to their native language, manners, and customs. The country is made up largely of small farms operated by independent farmers who usually live in humble stone cottages strung picturesquely throughout the heathered hills and valleys. About 8% of the people speak the Welsh language exclusively. 32% are bilingual, and the remainder speak English only. People may differ in language, but chickens are the same the world over. And in lands where a traveler may not be able to speak to his fellow men because of language barriers, the good old-fashioned cluck of a chicken sounds a universal note. On the seaboard coast of Wales stands one of the most historic old shrines in the British Isles, Carnarvon Castle, completed in the early part of the 13th century. The first Prince of Wales was born here over 600 years ago, and he later became King Edward II, in whose reign several magnificent castles were built to overawe the turbulent Welsh people. Perhaps the best known of these old shrines is Conway Castle, situated on the estuary of the Conway River. The original castle which stood on this site was built by Edward I, who was besieged here in 1290 and would have been starved into submission if it had not been for the timely arrival of a ship. Aside from history, we were particularly interested in the railroad tunnel and tracks built along the rear walls of this ancient fortress in such a manner as to blend with the setting, just as this comparatively modern bridge has been built in front of the castle. A praiseworthy tribute of the present to the past, and a fine example of how the new and the old can be harmonized without disturbing the sacred sentiments of tradition. Conway Bay provides excellent boating facilities for those who would cruise on waters that are noted for good fishing in a peaceful environment endowed with folklore and tradition. We are now in the region known as the Menai Straits, a channel about 14 miles long and a mile wide, which is crossed by the longest suspension bridge in the British Isles. This architectural masterpiece, known as the Menai Bridge, was completed in 1826. It is 580 feet long from pier to pier and about 1,700 feet overall. The total circuit of Wales is about 500 miles, and most of this consists of coastline, providing ideal settings for many seaside resorts, the largest of which is Llandudno, facing the Irish Sea. While wandering over the sands of this beach with a little girl named Alice Liddell, it is said that the author, Lewis Carroll, was inspired to write his famous story of Alice in Wonderland. Leaving the balmy breezes of the sea, we journey inland to the quaint little mountain resort of Betsy Coed, noted for its picturesque settings, reminding us somewhat of Switzerland. Almost the whole surface of Wales is mountainous or undulating, but there are few places of interest that cannot be reached by motor cars over good roads that pass through the most picturesque scenery in the Principality. The motor trip from Betsy Coed to Llanberis is unusually interesting, as it affords an ever-changing panorama of mountain and pastoral settings. Although the chief mineral product of Wales is coal, the slate quarries in the northwestern section are of great economic importance, as they produce the very finest quality of slate and provide employment for many thousands of workmen. On the north shore of beautiful Llanberis Lake, we pass the mammoth Dinnorwick slate quarries, rising terrace above terrace to the height of nearly 2,000 feet. The slate quarried here is used principally for roofing, tabletops, switchboards, blackboards, and stair treads, the more massive pieces being made into sinks and tubs. Even children in distant India carry to school slates that were quarried here. Mount Snowdon, forming a lofty backdrop to this lake, is the highest mountain in Wales, and it provides for hikers or mountain climbers one of the world's best ridge expeditions. Like most visitors here, however, we prefer to do our climbing by way of this unique little railway car, which makes the trip to the summit, a distance of 5 miles, in exactly 1 hour. The Swiss system of mountain railways is considered the most efficient yet invented, and it has been adapted on this line. The rails are firmly jointed and fastened down to prevent any slipping or breaking. The road is also anchored at intervals into massive concrete blocks to overcome its tendency to slide downhill. The engine works very smoothly and can be brought to a dead stop within the space of a few feet. Nevertheless, the sheep which we encounter along the way are somewhat of a menace, and our route at times takes us so close to the edge of the mountain that the safest railway in the world is not completely devoid of hair-raising thrills. Although the train in which we are riding passes over this route several times a day, the poor sheep never seem to learn the danger that lurks between the rails. Over the fence they go to quiet their palpitating hearts, while we ascend higher and higher toward the summit. En route, we pass a few stout-limbed mountain climbers who may have been at it for several hours. And now, from out the mountain mists, we behold the peak of Snowdon. Prior to the advent of the railway, only small groups of mountain climbers approached the abode of the Eagles, as Snowdon was once called. But today, thousands of tourists from all parts of the world regard the trip as one of the musts of world travel. After having a cup of hot tea in the Summit House, it is customary for visitors to explore the peak of Snowdon and enjoy the rugged scenery below. But now the shadows of twilight are beginning to fall over the mountains and in the valleys of Wales. And by way of conclusion, we can think of nothing more appropriate than a familiar Welsh lullaby, All Through the Night. When night descends on Chicago, the heart of the city, or the Loop as it is generally known, is brilliantly aglow with glimmering lights that lure us to its many attractions. We are now traveling along Randolph Street, which is noted for its many fine shops, restaurants, hotels, and theaters. Among the celebrated nightclubs on Randolph Street are the College Inn, perhaps the oldest of its kind in North America, and the Bismarck's colorful Walnut Room, which we now visit just in time to see Don Julian and Marjorie do their fantastic cape dance. Among the many well-known citizens of Chicago that we find here are the Honorable Martin H. Kennelly, Mayor of the city, Colonel Robert R. McCormick, publisher of the Chicago Tribune, General Charles G. Dawes, former Vice President of the United States, and Messrs. Carl and Otto Eitel, genial proprietors of the Bismarck. Continuing our nocturnal journey, we pass the world-famous Chicago Theater, which has been a leader of local motion picture exhibition for more than a generation, Don the Beachcombers, catering to exotic tastes, and the ever-popular Old Chez Paris, where internationally famous artists have entertained the public for a quarter of a century or more. now drive along Michigan Avenue by the majestic Wrigley Building, the white spirit of Chicago, and on to the Ambassador Hotel, finally settling down in the appetizing atmosphere of the renowned Pump Room, where food and drink are served with all the dramatic formalities of a royal banquet.
Drink to the health of Chicago, the city of friendship and cheer, where good fellows meet and life is a treat. Drink for the time draws near, when we'll say farewell to Chicago and travel the wide open trail. One last toast let's make to the Lady of the Lake. Hail Chicago, hail.
The Pump Room takes its name from the old pump room at Bath, England, which was established many centuries ago and reached the peak of its popularity under the capable management of Beau Nash, whose portrait now graces the bar of the Chicago Pump Room. And here we meet Ernie Byfield, character proprietor of this unique institution, who is not unlike the old Beau Nash himself, and with some misgivings we induced him to dress up in this costume to prove it. Seriously, Mr. Byfield is the descendant of a long line of celebrated hotel and restaurant operators. Go ahead, drink it. And he symbolizes a spirit of fun and conviviality that has made him one of the best-known characters in the gayer circles of the metropolis. And now we visit the famous Edgewater Beach Hotel for a glimpse of one of its colorful outdoor shows, staged under the capable direction of Dorothy Hill. Among the specialty numbers of the Boardwalk Productions, there is usually a novelty act, and on this occasion it happens to be a dancing horse. Although the horse may not be perfect in his sense of rhythm, he does depend upon a musical beat for his dancing paces. And as a matter of fact, he practically refuses to perform without music. so, as night descends upon Chicago, the famous centers of diversion which we have already visited, as well as the Empire Room, the Boulevard Room, the Camellia House, the Mayfair Room, and numerous others, are all aglow with the gaiety and hospitality that typify the nightlife of the city. And our concluding scene of the pale moon shining beside the dimly illuminated tower of the Edgewater Beach Hotel will always be a highlight in our photographic memoirs of nocturnal Chicago. The ancient University of Cambridge was founded upon this hallowed ground over 6 centuries ago, and foremost among the many fine buildings associated with the university is Clare College, gracing the banks of the Cam River. This peaceful little stream derived its name from the town of Cambridge, or Cambridge, which was originally called Grant Bridge. Among the many eminent scientists, poets, and statesmen who once attended Cambridge University, and incidentally patronized the little shops and walked in the same streets of the town as others less known do now, were Newton, Bacon, Byron, Thackeray, Tennyson, Walpole, Wordsworth, Milton, Darwin, Oliver Cromwell, Thomas Gray, Charles Kingsley, Edmund Spencer, Rupert Brooke, Samuel Coleridge, and John Harvard, benefactor of Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. When we consider what these world-famous men have contributed to civilization, we have an added respect for their alma mater and the old town in which they spent their collegiate years. And this is the thought that we take with us as we say farewell to Cambridge and continue our journey to another great seat of learning, the city of Oxford. Oxford has been a place of importance for over 1,000 years, and documentary evidence of this goes back to the year of 912. As might be expected in a town whose growth has been so gradual, the buildings present a pageant of architectural examples covering every period from Saxon times. St. Mary's Church, built in the latter part of the 14th century, has always been the university church. These odd-looking spiral columns are classified as Baroque in style, although they were placed here a century before the advent of the real Baroque era. Architecture at Oxford has always been of great importance, and to its embellishment were devoted the talents of several architects of high merit, including the greatest of them all, Christopher Wren, who designed the Sheldonian Greek Theater, which is fronted by this unique group of statues. The theater is used for many of the more important ceremonies of the university, as well as for special musical performances for which Oxford is noted. The University of Oxford comprises 21 colleges for men and 4 for women. Oddly enough, this building, which is known as New College, is actually one of the oldest. It was founded 113 years before Columbus discovered America, and its extensive gardens are still bounded by the remaining portion of the ancient city walls. Incidentally, George Washington's great-grandfather attended Oxford University in the year of 1619, and according to the records, when he left, he owed the buttery, or canteen, 17 shillings and 10 pence. This old debt was paid, however, in 1924 by a conscientious American visitor as a patriotic tribute to the father of his country. The largest and perhaps the most important of the colleges at Oxford is that of Christ Church. In the tower of this institution, there is a great bell which was hung there many centuries ago, when the college had only 101 students, in memory of whom every evening at 9:05, the bell strikes out 101 times, which is the signal for every college in Oxford to close its gates for the night. Christ Church contains the Cathedral diocese as well as the college chapel and a very colorful boys' choir. It was not until the year of 1920 that women students were admitted to full membership at Oxford, and their number has been limited to 1/4 that of the men. Here at Magdalen College, we are particularly fascinated by the flower gardens, typical of those which are spread so profusely over the grounds of the university. And now it is time for us to leave Oxford and visit another ancient place of learning in scholastic England, known as Eton College, and world famous as a school for boys. From the beginning, Eton maintained a connection with King's College, Cambridge. The students of Eton are mainly sons of the gentry or nobility, whose names are entered at birth, but many scholars or collegers are admitted each year tuition-free. Eton College, or the King's College of Our Lady of Eton beside Windsor, was founded by Henry VI in the year of 1440. The monument of the founder of the college in the center of the schoolyard is a popular gathering place for Eton boys, and it gives us an opportunity to observe a few of them close at hand. The tall boy in the center, who wears an unusually fancy vest, is known as a pop. Pop is Eton's exclusive social club. To us, this is a rather odd costume for schoolboys to wear, but it is traditional as well as individual, and it certainly distinguishes the boys at Eton from all others in the world. Among the college diversions, the most popular is cricket, which is also the national game of Great Britain. Cricket is played by two teams consisting of 11 players on a side. The bowler throws the ball at the wicket, near which stands one of the two batsmen, whose task is to keep the ball from hitting the wicket by stopping it or batting it afield, in which event the two batsmen exchange positions as many times as possible before the ball is fielded in. Vying with cricket in popularity at Eton is the sport of rowing on the Thames. And it is in this colorful setting that we most reluctantly conclude our limited impressions of scholastic England. Ottawa, pride of Ontario and capital city of Canada, around which the history of a democratic dominion has revolved for more than 3 centuries. It was chosen by Queen Victoria as the seat of government for the Dominion of Canada in 1858, and 7 years later, the first session of the Canadian Parliament was inaugurated here. Aside from history, These famous buildings are a fitting tribute to the development of Canada from a vast wilderness into a modern and progressive country. Rising impressively above the Parliament structures is the Peace Tower, containing Canada's immortal Book of Remembrance. Blending harmoniously with the old world charm of the Parliament buildings stands the imposing Chateau Laurier, named after the famous Canadian statesman, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, who was the first French-Canadian Prime Minister. It's a far cry from this majestic edifice and the modern times in which it is centered to the faraway days in old Huronia, when the disciples of civilization first scattered their seeds over the land that is now known as Ontario. These rare old paintings are actual scenes from the past when Fort Ste. Marie was the beacon light of civilization in North America. Among the Jesuit missionaries who first brought Christianity to the native Indians in Ontario, several were tortured to death by the heathens they tried to convert. And in commemoration of their martyrdom, this church, known as the Shrine of the Martyrs, now stands on the very ground in which the ashes of at least 2 of the martyrs were buried. Also, as a tribute to the early Jesuit priests who gave their lives in order that their Christian faith might bring its blessings to the pagan Indians, the Catholic Stations of the Cross have been erected by an anonymous benefactor on a hillside overlooking the valley of Old Huronia. Although the martyrs and the Indians of their day have all passed away, the rewards of their martyrdom have become the heritage of the Shrine of the Martyrs, where followers of the same faith in this modern day have been blessed with miraculous cures and spiritual consolation. Turning from the past to the present, we are reminded that Ontario is a land of lakes, where all the thrills of happy holidays may be found in great abundance, especially here at Big Win Inn on the Lake of Bays. We are told that this beautifully appointed modern summer resort was once the happy hunting ground of a tribe of Indians under the guidance of a great chief known as Big Win, in memory of whom the present resort is named. Ontario's great chain of lakes extends itself profusely throughout the province and offers a variety of settings, ranging from the grandness of Big Win to the simple and more rustic allure of Killarney Lodge in Algonquin Park, where we now pause to rest and play. Far from here, the great waterways of Ontario continue, seemingly without end. We are now cruising on Lake Opiongo, the largest body of water in Algonquin Park, which is noted for its sequestered glens, rolling hills, and good fishing. Scenes like this inspired Wilfred Campbell, the Canadian poet, to write, "Here where the jewels of nature are set in the light of God's smile, far from the world's wild throbbing, I will stay me and rest a while." In this land of lakes, portage by canoe is a popular diversion, even as it was once the chief means of travel for the Indians and first white traders. Well, look who's here. Who said fishing was exclusively for men? And she's got something on the end of the line, too. But it's not a fish. Go ahead, try it again and again and again. It's fun. Then sit down here with the men and enjoy the fish which they caught and you should have cooked. water, water everywhere. And it's not necessary to journey great distances from the key centers to enjoy it. Strange as it may seem, this is a waterway in the city of Toronto. Being a land of lakes, it is only natural that Ontario should also be a land of boats. We are now visiting the Royal Canadian Yacht Club in Toronto, one of Canada's outstanding centers of diversion. In a province that owes much to its Scottish forebears, it is only natural that the spirit of Scotland should be perpetuated by a Highland Lassie band. Just across the bay from the Yacht Club, we behold the hazy skyline of Toronto, Ontario's capital and Canada's second largest city, as well as an important shipping center for boats plying the Great Lakes. The Ontario Provincial Parliament buildings in Queen's Park vie with those of the Dominion in Ottawa in dignified old-world grandeur, and their substantial appearance reflects the character of the government they house. Another charming old landmark in Toronto is this so-called Casa Loma, built by the late Major General Sir Henry Pellet in fulfillment of a boyhood dream. Situated as it is on Lake Ontario, midway between New York and Chicago, Toronto has become a popular convention city, thereby justifying its Indian name, Toronto, which means a place of meeting. No visit to Ontario would be complete without a trip to Niagara Falls, and one of the most delightful approaches to it is by boat from Toronto across Lake Ontario. The journey requires only a few hours, and it leads us to one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, Niagara Falls. It has been estimated that the beauty and grandeur of Niagara Falls and its adjacent parks attract over 2 million visitors every year. To provide for this transient trade, numerous hotels and restaurants have been established on both sides of the Niagara River, and among the best of these is the General Brock Hotel, which features a roof garden restaurant from which may be seen a general view of Niagara Falls and all its grandeur. This is Lansing, Michigan, one of America's foremost centers for the manufacture of automobiles. Hardly more than a century ago, it was a wilderness with one log cabin and a sawmill. Then it suddenly became the choice of the state fathers for a capital city, remote enough, they thought, to be safe from foreign invasion. On the grounds of the State College of Agriculture and Applied Science stands the Spartan, a bronze statue which symbolizes the fighting spirit that built one of the nation's foremost contributions to agriculture and science. This edifice, known as Beaumont Tower, stands on the site of the first college in the United States that was devoted exclusively to the teaching of agricultural science. Outstanding among the educational institutions of the state is the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and it is particularly noted for its modern interpretation of tolerance, as well as its teachings of the democratic principles of life. The state fish hatchery at Grayling was originally conceived by a group of civic-minded anglers who were concerned about an adequate supply of fish for the many popular trout streams of their state. In these narrow little canals, the fish are reared up to 7 inches or more. Then they are let loose in the streams that flow throughout the adjacent counties. Aside from this, the Grayling hatchery is a popular attraction for visitors, and one of the favored privileges is to be permitted to feed the fish. But the little girl in this instance apparently doesn't consider it much of a privilege. When the time comes for stocking or fish planting, the specimens chosen are gathered in this manner. Incidentally, the name grayling was taken from a species of fish that once inhabited the streams of Michigan. They were caught by the thousands until during the latter part of the 19th century, they virtually disappeared. This necessitated replenishing the streams with newer and varied species through the good services of the state fish hatcheries, so that today, Michigan boasts of having a generous supply of the best stocked streams in North America, not the least of which is the Osable River near Grayling, where canoe fishing is a popular sport. The Osable River flows from Grayling to Lake Huron, about 180 miles, and most of the distance can be paddled in a canoe. And now let us turn from these peaceful haunts and gaze upon one of the commercial marts of man, Detroit, the great automobile metropolis of the world, where the Ambassador Bridge spans the Detroit River and connects the United States with Canada. Long before the advent of the automobile, Detroit was a cosmopolitan city, and it is still proud of its diversified industries. Nevertheless, Detroit has become so firmly associated with automobiles that it is now regarded as the automotive capital of the world. And well it might be, for 3/5 of the world's automobiles are made in Michigan, and the bulk of these are FOB Detroit. This automotive empire consumes 4/5 of American rubber imports, and more than half of the plate glass and upholstery leather used by the entire nation. Detroit was founded in 1701 by Antoine Cadillac in the name of France, but was acquired by Great Britain at the close of the French and Indian War and held as a British possession until 1796, at which time it was relinquished to the United States. Among the manufacturing products which first established it as an industrial center were bicycles and carriages, the forerunners of its present-day automobile industry. The Detroit River forms a strait between Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair, and because of this, the French named the city Detroit, meaning the strait. Today, the Detroit River has reached the height of its significance as an artery of commercial traffic, plying constantly between the city of Detroit and the Great Lakes. And it is said that it provides passage for more tonnage than any other inland waterway throughout North America. Facing the waters of Lake St. Clair stands the famous Grosse Pointe Yacht Club, home port for many of the best pleasure boats that ply the Great Lakes. Grosse Pointe is also known as Detroit's Gold Coast, where we find the summer homes of many of the fortunate ones who profited by the industrial development of the city. The Detroit park system includes many children's playgrounds, fully equipped with extensive facilities for wholesome diversion. A few miles from here, in the suburbs of the city, stands one of the most interesting little communities in America, and it is known as Greenfield Village, founded by Henry Ford, wherein may be seen original models or reproductions of the media of transportation, machinery, and early American architecture, outstanding among which is this facsimile of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Prior to Mr. Ford's advent in the automobile industry, he was keenly interested in the manufacture of timepieces. And this reproduction of a world-famous institution houses a unique collection of antique watches and jewelry. The mythical figures of Gog and Magog striking the hours are originals and were transported from the ancient Bennett jewelry firm of London, along with a considerable portion of the facade. A duplicate of the old Swanee steamer upon which Thomas Edison, an intimate friend of Henry Ford, once passed his rare moments of spare time fishing. A portion of the Swanee River was actually reproduced for the boat, and beside the stream, the birthplace of Stephen Foster, composer of the immortal Swanee River Song, was very appropriately transplanted, as we see it here. The Noah Webster House, in which the famous American lexicographer compiled his original dictionary, is typical of the homes of well-to-do Americans in the early 19th century. A replica of a stone house from Cotswold, England, where Henry Ford personally acquired most of the stones and furnishings. This old windmill was transported here from Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The house in which Luther Burbank, the famous horticulturist, was born in 1849. The old railway station, where the precocious young newsboy Tom Edison was ejected as a result of a fire on the train caused by a chemical explosion in the baggage car, where young Edison had rigged up a laboratory. Perhaps there is no greater landmark in Greenfield Village than the birthplace of its founder, the late Henry Ford, who was born in this house on July 30th, 1863. A champion of democracy and a disciple of hard work, Henry Ford proved the merits of private enterprise in a democratic country and gave to the world the results of his genius. For this, the world in general, and the automobile industry in particular, commemorates his memory, while the endless line of cars to which he contributed so much continues to flow from the city of Detroit out into the world at large. And it is with this thought that we now conclude our call on Michigan. Summertime is time for relaxation and fun at your favorite resort. There are thousands to choose from, but on this particular occasion, our choice happens to be the little town of Saugatuck in the state of Michigan, where the Kalamazoo River wends its peaceful way, and all seems to be right with the world. According to legend, this picturesque stream, which flows through 200 miles of Michigan, received its name from the Indian words Ki Kalamazoo, meaning where the water boils in the pot, for the Indians discovered many boiling springs in the riverbed. What was once the happy hunting and fishing domain of the Indian is now a haven of relaxation and diversion for the white man. Tourism is one of Michigan's major industries, and no small amount of the annual revenue derived from it comes from little resorts like Saugatuck, which is a veritable paradise for vacationists. As a rule, the tempo of life here is slow and peaceful, but occasionally the old Kalamazoo is aroused from its slumber by performances like this. Aside from diversions on the Kalamazoo, Saugatuck takes great pride in its famous summer school of painting, which is patronized by students of all ages. Classes are taught by distinguished artist instructors, most of whom are recognized teachers in leading universities. At the little town of Colon in southwestern Michigan, we are entertained by Percy Abbott, the Magic King, who has been conducting a flourishing and unique business here for the past 20 years. In fact, it requires a 640-page catalog to list the magic articles manufactured in Mr. Abbott's shop, and this is only one of them. Presto! Once a year, Colon's population of 800 is about doubled for 1 week in September, when professional illusionists and amateur students of hocus pocus from all parts of America gather for a jamboree, at which they exchange ideas and try to baffle one another, buying and swapping tricks. Percy Abbott himself is an old-time magician, and many of the tricks he sells are his own invention. Magic, he says, is the oldest of human arts and the most popular of hobbies. There are probably 1 million people in the United States alone who like to dabble with magic of some sort, and about 50,000 are professionals. He claims that any parlor amateur can perform most of his tricks, but here is one that is quite baffling. We promise not to tell how it is done, but maybe you can figure it out. Amazing! How does he do it? And now we'll leave Abbott the Great with his tricks and continue our journey into the playlands of Michigan. This is Lake Macatawa, an offshoot of Lake Michigan, and a popular resort for those who enjoy aquatic sports. Macatawa is also a favorite rendezvous for yachtsmen from all over the Great Lakes, and it features annual sailboat regattas. This colorful resort is particularly noted for its water ski carnivals, in which many of the nation's champions compete for prizes. Aside from being architecturally unique, the Macatawa Hotel rates high among the resort hotels of Michigan. Not far from here is the little town of Zeeland, where the descendants of its Dutch founders perpetuate the manners and customs of old Holland. During the month of May, Zeeland and its sister town of Holland celebrate the Tulpen Feast, during which prize-winning tulips are exhibited, and the Klampen, a native Dutch dance, is featured. Continuing our journey northward, we speed past Prospect Point, another popular playland at Spring Lake, and out into the waters of Lake Michigan, where we settle down for a little fishing at Grand Haven. In a typical year, Lake Michigan yields about 9 million pounds of fish to commercial fishermen, but apparently this is an off day for the amateurs. For never before have we seen so many fishermen at one sitting with so few fish. So we'll forget fishing and go for a swim in the delightful surf at Grand Haven Beach. Continuing northward, we arrive at Floridale, just in time to join a merry party on their way to the famous Silver Lake sand dunes. Although the dunes are constantly shifting and varying in depth, making established routes impossible, these formidable vehicles are geared and wheeled to travel with reasonable safety anywhere on the dunes. After a few miles of skidding on the sand dunes, we return to more solid ground. And even the rickety-looking bridge over which we passed with some temerity on our way to the dunes now feels like the world's safest structure. And it is here that we most reluctantly say farewell to the playlands of Michigan. Conspicuously situated on a promontory overlooking the St. Lawrence River stands the quaint city of Quebec, a citadel of history, chivalry, culture, and romance, where heroic Frenchmen such as Cartier, Frontenac, Champlain, and Montcalm founded and built New France in North America. The majestic building on top of the promontory is the famous Chateau Frontenac, patterned after a 16th century chateau, and operated as a modern and progressive 20th century hotel. The port of Quebec, with 6 miles of deep water frontage and one of the world's largest dry docks, now handles about 2 million tons of commodities annually. But our interest is in the scenes of old Quebec, such as the native market, where business is conducted very much as it was in the days when the coins exchanged bore the inscriptions of the French kings. Quebec entertains over 1 million tourists each year, and sightseeing is at its best when riding in a calèche. This grand fortress reminds us that Quebec is the only walled city in North America. About 9 miles from here, we behold Montmorency Falls, 100 feet higher than the Great Cataract of Niagara. This little elevator car provides transportation from the falls to the historically renowned Kent House, which was once owned and inhabited by the father of Queen Victoria, the Duke of Kent. It is now one of Quebec's most famous inns. En route to the shrine of St. Anne de Beaupré, we pause to admire typical scenes along the way. The art of hook rug making in Quebec has been handed down from generation to generation, and some of the patterns used are so old that their origin has been lost in tradition. Most of the products sold are woven or spun on old-fashioned spinning wheels, which are still in common use. A delightful aroma of freshly baked bread permeates the air as these loaves are removed from the crude bake oven, designed centuries ago by the early French settlers. And now we arrive at the sacred shrine of St. Anne de Beaupré, which is visited annually by almost 1 million pilgrims and has come to be known as the Lourdes of America. About 3 centuries ago, some French sailors constructed a crude chapel here in honor of St. Anne, whom they believed saved them from shipwreck. Soon after the construction of the little chapel, miracles became associated with it, and eventually it began to attract the attention of the Christian world. The present modern construction is a splendid tribute to the memory of the devout sailors who were responsible for the founding of one of the most sacred shrines in the history of Christendom. On the Isle of Orleans, not far from Quebec, the pursuits of agriculture are still the mainstay of the native population, which is decidedly French. In fact, the English language is so foreign here that we required an interpreter to translate for us. And here is a colorful example of one man's idea of home sweet home on the Isle of Orleans. About 70 miles north of Montreal in the famed Laurentian Hills, we visit St. Adèle Lodge, which is typical of Quebec's many fine year-round resorts. We are fortunate to be here in time to witness some fancy diving by the champions of Quebec. But let's not be so serious about all this, especially when we have a troupe of highfalutin clowns waiting to perform for us. Come on, boys, bring on your act. Continuing the more serious business of sightseeing, we arrive at Mount Royal, from which the city of Montreal derives its name. It is customary to ride up to the summit of Mount Royal in a horse-drawn vehicle for an impressive panoramic view of the largest city in Canada and the third largest French-speaking city in the world, Montreal. This grand metropolis encompasses historic relics of the early French regime, famous old churches and homes, contrasting with modern office buildings, hotels, smart shops, and theaters. It is also the seat of McGill University and the University of Montreal. Although Montreal is 800 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, it is the second largest seaport in North America, and it is from this port that we now embark on the good ship Tadoussac for a cruise down the St. Lawrence and into the Saguenay River. Perhaps there is no more delightful 6-day boat trip in all the world than this one. For aside from scenic grandeur, it takes us through the St. Lawrence Valley, about which historians have written volumes, and it leads us into the ancient Saguenay fjords, where red men and white men conducted a flourishing business with each other long before the Pilgrims set foot on Plymouth Rock. With the cities of Montreal and Quebec behind us, we are now in the wide open expanses of the St. Lawrence, enjoying beautiful vistas of land, water, and sky. At Murray Bay, we stop for a brief visit to the famous Manoir Richelieu, which is open to tourists from June to October. We are overwhelmed at the pretentiousness of this secluded hostelry, so far from the madding crowd, yet ultra-modern in its appointments and conveniences. After a brief stop at the Manoir Richelieu, we continue our journey down the St. Lawrence in the direction of Tadoussac. Our ship has now become a floating home, and the spirit of comradeship is in full sway. In reviewing the history of the St. Lawrence Valley, we recall the great part that was played in its development by the French missionaries. And here we meet two of their followers, who are members of a very strict and somewhat remote order of the Catholic Church. Handshaking gets a little confusing at times, but after the formalities of introduction are over, we find these odd-looking gentlemen of the cloth to be most interesting and quite friendly. In 1615, a Franciscan friar established a mission here at Tadoussac, and for about 50 years thereafter, it was the center of all civilized activity in Canada. The little church on the right was founded in 1747 by the Jesuits, and the impressive building next to the church is the new Tadoussac Hotel, a popular resort for summer vacationists. Now we have come to the junction of the St. Lawrence and Saguenay rivers, and in the hour of twilight, as the Union Jack goes down with the sun, our good ship rounds the promontory and enters the Saguenay. It takes about 6 hours to sail from the mouth to its source in Lake St. John near the port of Bagotville. En route, we are enthralled with the scenes that loom up on every side, reminding us somewhat of the Norwegian fjords. About 40 miles upstream, Capes Trinity and Eternity rise sheer from the water, 500 feet higher than the world's tallest building. Aside from scenic grandeur, we are told that the Saguenay River is the habitat of the world's finest salmon. We arrive after dark at Bagotville and leave early the next morning on our return journey. The downstream wind is so strong that it blows the smoke from our boat in an odd direction as we slow down to get a better view of the famous Madonna of the Saguenay, standing like a sentinel on Cape Trinity. And it is here in the beautiful valley of the Saguenay that we most reluctantly say farewell to Quebec.